The Tech God of Muzutafu. A serialized fanfiction. Act 1. The Architect of Ruin and Rebirth. Act 1. The Architect of Ruin and Rebirth. Chapter 1. The Boy Without a Quirk. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Izuku Midoriya sat in the sterile waiting room of the quirk registry office with his mother's hand wrapped around his like a warm shell protecting something fragile. The fluorescent light above buzzed with the particular annoyance of things that pretend to be functional. Inko had been squeezing his fingers rhythmically for the last 40 minutes, and Izuku had been counting the squeezes the way other children counted ceiling tiles. He was 4 years old and already very good at counting. The doctor who delivered the news had kind eyes and a clipboard he held like a shield. He explained the extra joint in Izuku's little toe with the careful diction of a man who had practiced the speech and still had not perfected it. Quirkless. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward until they touched everything. Inko did not cry in the office. She saved that for the car, turned toward the window so Izuku would not see her face. But Izuku had always been very good at noticing things, and he noticed the way her shoulders moved, and he noticed the way the city outside the window kept moving anyway, indifferent, full of people with abilities who were not thinking about him at all. He did not cry. He looked at his hands. They were ordinary hands. Small, a little soft, the knuckles slightly prominent the way all children's knuckles were. No visible manifestation of power. No glow, no charge, no subtle distortion of the air around them. Just hands. He turned them over and over in his lap the whole drive home, studying them with the intensity he would later apply to schematics and probability matrices and the structural tolerances of composite alloys. If these hands would never throw fire or move mountains or stop time, he thought, then what exactly were they for? He was 4 years old. It would take him another 6 to begin answering that question. The apartment on Eldora Street was small and warm and full of the smell of Inko's cooking. She made katsudon on bad days and Izuku had learned to associate the smell of pork cutlets with the understanding that something needed to be healed. That night she made a pot large enough to feed 4 people, and the 2 of them ate at the little table by the window while the city hummed outside and the television played a hero broadcast on low volume. All Might was on. He always seemed to be on. The symbol of peace stood at the center of a crumbled highway overpass, his cape torn at one edge, his smile so enormous and certain that it seemed to be a structural feature of the broadcast itself. Around him, 17 people stood at varying distances from the danger they had just survived. All Might raised one fist toward the camera, and the crowd behind the news barrier erupted, and Izuku watched all of this with a green notebook open beside his plate. He was filling in the notebook with careful observations. Muscle activation sequence. Approximate thrust vector. Wind resistance based on cape behavior. The structural weakness in the overpass that had made it collapse in the first place and the 3 points where a reinforced support column might have prevented the incident entirely. He was 4 years old and already filling his 3rd notebook. Izuku, Inko said softly. He looked up. You can still be whatever you want to be. She said it with the full weight of a mother who meant it and the slight tremor of a mother who was afraid she was wrong. Izuku looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the notebook. Then he looked at All Might on the television, enormous and blazing, the product of a quirk so powerful it had bent the shape of the entire society around it. I know, he said. And he meant it in a way that was different from the way she meant it, but she would not understand the difference for another 12 years. He closed the notebook and ate his katsudon and watched the city through the window. Outside, the hero industry glittered. Chapter 2, The Education of a Ghost. The years between diagnosis and understanding were not kind years, but they were productive ones. Izuku attended Eldora Elementary and later Eldora Middle School and was not happy in either place, but happiness had never been the primary metric by which he evaluated his own progress. Mitsuki Bakugo, who had been his friend until the day the quirk registry issued its verdict and his explosions first manifested, had reoriented their relationship entirely around the concept of dominance. Izuku was quirkless. Mitsuki was not. In the social architecture of a school system built entirely around the premise that quirks determined value, this translated into something simple and brutal. Izuku documented it. He documented everything. He documented the force vectors of explosion impacts against different surface materials. He documented the thermal output of Katsuki's palms at varying levels of emotional agitation. He documented the exact social dynamics that permitted a system of sustained cruelty to function in an institutional setting, the way authority figures responded to reports from quirkless students differently than to reports from quirk-bearing ones, the gap between the stated values of the hero education pipeline and the actual behavior it incentivized. By age 11 he had written a 40-page analysis of structural failures in Japanese hero support item procurement. His homeroom teacher, when presented with this document, asked if his mother had written it for him. Inko, when informed of this response, had pursed her lips in a very controlled way and then called the school administration in a voice that suggested she was selecting her words with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. Nothing changed. Nothing changed, but Izuku kept writing. What saved him was the library and what lived inside it. Mitsuki had a public library 3 blocks from the apartment with a basement engineering section that most of its patrons had apparently never visited. The librarian down there was an elderly man named Sato who wore the same gray cardigan every day and who recognized, in the small green-haired boy who appeared one afternoon in his 3rd year of elementary school and began systematically reading his way through the structural engineering shelf, something that warranted quiet encouragement. Sato did not say much. He refilled Izuku's water glass without being asked. He put relevant books on the corner of the table when Izuku arrived. He obtained, through channels Izuku never inquired about, access to academic journals that were not officially part of the public collection. In this way, over the next several years, Izuku read his way through mechanical engineering, electrical systems, materials science, applied physics, computer architecture, support item design theory, and the publicly available technical specifications for every registered hero support device in Japan. He kept notes. He kept very careful notes. The notes became observations. The observations became critiques. The critiques became, by the time he was 13, detailed proposals for redesigns that would improve existing support technology by margins ranging from 20% to, in the case of 2 particular devices, an order of magnitude. He sent one of these proposals, anonymously, to the R&D division of a mid-tier hero support company. They implemented a modified version of his suggestion 4 months later and filed a patent under their own name. He was not surprised. He was not even particularly angry. He filed it under the category of useful data about how institutions behave when they encounter ideas that arrive without the credentials they expect. He started keeping better records. By the time he was 14 and entering his 2nd year of middle school, the notebooks numbered 47. They were stored in a waterproof case under his bed and catalogued by subject in a filing system he had designed himself. The walls of his room were covered in diagrams the way other boys' walls were covered in hero posters. There was one hero poster. It was of All Might, and it lived on the back of the door where Izuku could see it only when the door was closed, and over the years he had added, in pencil, annotations around the edges that would have been incomprehensible to most adults. The annotations were not cruel. They were honest, which in the context of All Might amounted to the same thing. He had identified, through careful analysis of broadcast footage, the progressive physical deterioration that the symbol of peace had been hiding for several years. The cadence of his movements had changed. The duration of his public appearances had shortened. The suppression of effort in his smile had become, to trained eyes, marginally less successful. Izuku had very trained eyes. He added a note to this section of his observations: the hero system is load-bearing on a single point of failure. He underlined it twice. Then he went to the kitchen to help his mother with dinner and did not mention it, because there was no one in his life to mention it to. This was the particular loneliness of being a genius in a world that had already decided what genius looked like, and had concluded that it looked like a boy with a powerful quirk, not a boy with 47 notebooks and a gift for structural analysis that had never been officially recognized by anyone. It was a loneliness he carried quietly. He was very practiced at carrying things quietly. Chapter 3, The Day He Met the Machine. The turning point arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early April when Izuku was 15. He had been walking home from school by the long route, which he took on days when Katsuki and his companions had been particularly focused on demonstrating the hierarchy, Because the long route went past the canal and along the old industrial district, and there was something in the scale of the abandoned factory buildings there that made his own circumstances feel proportional. Small problems inside large structures. The architecture of the world did not care about either. The factory at the end of Kamino Avenue had been closed for 11 years and was scheduled for demolition in 2 months. This was public record. What was not public record was that someone had been using it. The side door was open by approximately 4 centimeters. The padlock had been cut with something precise. The cut pattern was consistent with a high-frequency vibration tool rather than bolt cutters. Izuku stood at the door for 9 seconds, catalogued these observations, calculated the probable risk profile, and went inside. The interior was enormous and dim and smelled of machine oil and ozone. The late afternoon light came through skylights caked with industrial grime, diffusing into something amber and directionless. The factory floor, which had once held textile machinery, now held something else. Someone had built a workshop. Not a small workshop. A serious one. The benches ran the length of the eastern wall and were covered with tools that Izuku recognized and tools he did not, which immediately captured his full attention because there was very little in the domain of engineering tools that he could not identify. A central workbench held the remains of what appeared to be a disassembled industrial support rig of a type used by Class A ranked heroes, except that the disassembly had not been destructive. The components were laid out in a sequence that suggested reverse engineering, systematic, patient, structured by function rather than manufacturer assembly order. Someone had taken the thing apart to understand it. Izuku was across the factory floor before he made a conscious decision to move. He stood over the disassembled rig and read it. That was the only word for what he did. He read it the way other people read text, moving through the components in their laid-out sequence with his hands almost touching and his eyes moving fast and something inside him beginning to accelerate in a way that had no physical analog, only the internal experience of recognition, of a language being spoken that he had always known. The rig was a weight redistribution harness designed for heroes with enhanced strength quirks, meant to prevent structural damage to the human skeleton during high-impact operations. The engineering was competent. It was also, in Izuku's estimation, wrong in 6 places. Not catastrophically wrong. Wrong in the quiet ways that suggested the original designer had been working from first principles without access to certain material science literature published in the last 3 years. He pulled out his notebook. He began writing. He wrote for 40 minutes before the sound of a door opening at the far end of the factory registered, and by then it was already too late to leave without being seen. The man who came through the door was older than Izuku expected. Somewhere between 50 and 60, with the compact build of someone who had once been physically active and had retained the underlying structure without the active maintenance. He wore a canvas work apron over a plain shirt and carried a takeout bag in one hand and stopped completely when he saw Izuku standing at his workbench with an open notebook and an expression that probably conveyed, in retrospect, that he had been there for some time. They looked at each other. "You're in the wrong building," the man said. "The tension calibration on the posterior lumbar supports is set to assume a uniform weight distribution," Izuku said, "but enhanced strength quirks typically produce asymmetric force applications because dominant side muscle groups in quirk activation are almost always larger. If this harness is used by someone with a right dominant power augmentation, the left posterior mount will fatigue at approximately 2/3 the rated cycle count." A long silence. "How old are you?" the man said. 15. Another silence. The man set down his takeout bag on the nearest clear surface. He walked to the workbench and looked at the component Izuku had been describing, and then at Izuku's notebook, and then at Izuku. "Your name," the man said. "Midoriya Izuku." "Your quirk." Izuku met his eyes. "I don't have one." The man, whose name Izuku would learn was Kenichi Mura, former lead engineer at a support company that no longer existed, looked at him for a long time. Then he pulled a stool up to the workbench, pointed at a second stool, and sat down. "Show me the other places you think it's wrong," he said. Izuku sat down and showed him. He was there until midnight. Inko called 4 times. He texted back apologizing at the 3rd call and explaining at the 4th, and she was worried and then furious and then, When he came home with oil on his hands and a look in his eyes she had not seen since he was very small and had not yet learned to hide his enthusiasm, she was something else. Something that looked at him across the dinner table while he described what he had seen and what he had identified, and recognized, with the particular clarity of a mother who has been paying close attention for 15 years, that her son had found something that mattered. She did not say this. She put more rice in his bowl and asked questions and let him talk. He was still talking when she finally told him it was nearly 2 in the morning and he needed to sleep. He went to his room and lay down on his bed with the lights off and the ceiling above him and his hands behind his head. The factory smell was still on his clothes. Somewhere in the city, heroes were doing whatever heroes did at 2 in the morning, and the support infrastructure that kept them functional was full of the quiet, unmeasured errors that accumulated when engineering was treated as secondary to quirk power. Izuku thought about the workbench. He thought about the way the components had been laid out. He thought about Kenichi Mura's expression when he had correctly identified the 5th flaw and the man had stopped correcting him and started writing things down himself. He thought, this is what I am for. He did not sleep for another 2 hours, and when he did, he dreamed in schematics. Chapter 4, The Apprentice and the Architect. Kenichi Mura was not a good teacher in the conventional sense. He did not explain. He demonstrated, then watched, then corrected, and his corrections were surgical in their specificity and occasionally delivered with a bluntness that would have been discouraging to a different kind of student. Izuku was not a different kind of student. He came to the factory on Tuesdays and Thursdays after school and all day Saturdays, for the 2 months before the building was demolished, and then in the new workshop that Mura rented on the edge of the Naruhata district with the assistance of funds that Izuku did not ask about and which he suspected had been obtained through a combination of old professional contacts and the quiet sale of several things Mura had been holding for a long time. In the new workshop, which was smaller and better lit and smelled of fresh concrete instead of old oil, Izuku began to build things. The first thing he built was a version of the corrected weight redistribution harness. It took 11 weeks and 3 complete rebuilds, and the test data, run on a rig that Mura had assembled from salvaged components, confirmed every prediction Izuku had made in his notebook that first afternoon. The improved version performed at 42% better fatigue tolerance than the original on asymmetric load profiles. Mura looked at the test data for a long time. Then he said, "Don't file a patent." "I know," Izuku said. They did not discuss why. Both of them understood the architecture of the support industry well enough to know that a quirkless 15-year-old filing a performance improvement patent on hero gear would encounter a process designed to make that filing difficult, and that the outcome was not guaranteed to favor the filing party. Izuku kept the design in a notebook and built something else. The second thing he built was a sensory augmentation headset designed to extend the operational range of perception-type quirks without requiring the user to consciously amplify their own power output. This was more complex. It required him to learn the basics of neural signal interfacing, which required 3 months of reading and several weeks of increasingly heated conversations with Mura, who had strong opinions about the inadvisability of connecting electronic components to the human nervous system in an unlicensed workshop. Izuku did not connect the headset to himself. He tested it on a haptic feedback sleeve that simulated the neural load profile of an active perception quirk. The results were elegant. "Where did you learn about neural signal interfacing?" Mura said, examining the test results. "Mostly from a thesis published at Nabu University 6 years ago," Izuku said. "And some of it I worked out from first principles because the relevant literature had gaps." Mura put down the test results. He rubbed his face with one hand in the way he did when something had surpassed his expectations and he was deciding how to respond to that. "You worked out applied neural signal interfacing from first principles. Some of it needed correcting. I'll show you the derivations if you want." "I don't," Mura said. "I believe you." "That's the problem." He stood up and went to put the kettle on, which was his way of indicating that a conversation was transitioning into territory he needed to think about carefully. Izuku waited. "You understand," Mura said from the small kitchen area, "that what you're doing in here is not legal." "I understand that unlicensed support item development is a regulatory violation with a fine structure that scales by item classification," Izuku said. "The items I've been building are below the threshold that triggers criminal liability." "Barely." "Yes." The kettle clicked. Mura poured 2 cups and brought them back and sat down and looked at Izuku with the expression he wore when he was about to say something that mattered. You could go to UA, he said. Support course. With what you can already do, they'd take you. Izuku wrapped both hands around his cup. I know. But you're not going to. Izuku was quiet for a moment. On the workbench, the sensory augmentation headset sat in its test cradle, an elegant thing, precise and purposeful. He had built it in an unlicensed workshop with salvaged materials and his own analysis, and it worked better than anything currently on the commercial market, and if he submitted it through official channels the process would extract it from him and file it under someone else's name and he would receive a certificate of commendation and a polite letter about future licensing agreements. The support course trains people to build things for the hero system, Izuku said. I want to understand whether the hero system is the right architecture in the first place. Mura drank his tea. He did not argue. He had, over the year of knowing Izuku, developed a precise understanding of when argument was useful and when it simply established that both parties already understood each other. Then you need resources, he said finally. More than this. Yes. I know some people, Mura said. He said it in the careful way that meant the people he knew existed in the space between official channels and illegal ones, which was a space Izuku had been studying for 2 years now and which turned out to be significantly more populated than the official history of the hero industry suggested. I know you know some people, Izuku said. I've been trying to figure out which ones for 6 months. Mura looked at him. Then he laughed, which was a sound Izuku had heard very few times and which transformed the man's face entirely. You've been investigating me. I prefer conducting background research, but yes. Mura shook his head. He was still smiling, which was rarer than laughter. All right, he said. I'll make some calls. Chapter 5, Blueprint for an Independent World. The people Mura knew were not criminals. This was the first thing Izuku confirmed, methodically, before he met any of them. They were something more difficult to categorize, engineers and technicians and a few former academics who had, at various points in their careers, concluded that the licensed support industry was structurally incapable of producing the work they wanted to do. Some had left voluntarily. Some had been pushed out. All of them had continued working, quietly, in spaces that the official regulatory framework had not yet found reason to examine. They operated as a loose network. They shared materials and technical knowledge and the occasional favor. They did not share politics or aesthetics or personal histories. They shared the particular solidarity of people who had chosen competence over credentialing and were paying the associated costs. Izuku met them over the course of 3 months. He brought notebooks. He asked questions that were better than the questions most engineers twice his age asked, and he listened to the answers with a quality of attention that several of them described afterward, to Mura, as unsettling in the most productive possible sense. He was 16. He had notebooks now numbering past 80. He had built 6 functional devices of increasing sophistication and documented every stage of every build with the completeness of someone who was not practicing but archiving. He was archiving because he had a plan. The plan had started as a set of questions and refined itself, over 2 years of background analysis and quiet observation, into something with the coherence of a structural blueprint. The hero system was a centralized, commission-dependent, quirk-centric model. Its dependencies made it brittle in specific ways. The brittleness was not theoretical. It manifested in observable outcomes: heroes who burned out, civilians in underserved areas who received inadequate protection, the quiet institutional tolerance of practices that benefited powerful agencies at the cost of individuals who lacked sufficient quirk ratings or political capital. The system was not evil. Evil was simple. The system was optimized for the wrong outcomes, and the people inside it were incentivized to maintain it because the alternatives had never been made credible. Izuku intended to make an alternative credible. He laid out the plan to Mura one evening in late autumn when the workshop was warm and the city outside was doing the particular thing cities do in early dark, all window-lit and inscrutable. He laid it out in sections, moving through the logic step by step, because Mura was not someone who responded well to conclusions presented without the preceding argument. An independent zone of operations. Not a criminal enterprise. Not a vigilante organization. Something different, a self-sufficient enclave with its own power generation, its own technological infrastructure, its own internal economy built on non-commission dependent engineering. A place that could produce capabilities the hero system could not, by operating outside the constraints the hero system imposed on itself. Mora listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not his natural tendency. That's not a workshop, he said, when Izuku finished. That's a city. Not initially. Initially it's a compound. A compound becomes a city when it solves enough problems that people want to be there. And where does a 16-year-old get the capital to build a compound? Izuku set a file on the workbench. It was thick. The same way you get capital to build anything, he said. You make something people want to buy, and you sell it, and you reinvest the proceeds in the infrastructure. Mora opened the file. He looked at the first 3 pages and then looked at Izuku over the top of them. You've already built prototypes. 4 of the 6 designs in that file are fully functional. The other 2 need materials I don't have access to yet. But those first 4 can be sold through the gray market right now, through your contacts, at prices that are lower than commercial equivalents and with performance margins that would make them worth buying at twice the price. Mora put the file down slowly. He had the look of a man recalculating a large number. You came into my workshop a year ago. 14 months, Izuku said. And the plan existed before I came to the workshop. The workshop was to confirm whether the plan was technically feasible. And is it? It's feasible. It'll take time. Probably 6 to 8 years to reach the scale where the compound becomes self-sustaining. But the trajectory is clear. Mora sat with this for a long moment. Outside, the city continued its uninterested operations. A siren moved through the middle distance, hero dispatch frequency, fading east. What do you need from me? Mora said. Izuku had been waiting for this question since he had started the conversation. To start, introductions to the network members who have materials access. And your honest engineering assessment of the first 4 designs, because I don't want to sell something I haven't had someone else verify. You want me to tell you if you're wrong. I want you to tell me where I'm wrong. I'm sure I'm wrong somewhere. I always am. I just need to know where so I can fix it before I build on top of the error. Mora picked up the file again. He turned to the first technical specification sheet. He read it with the slow thoroughness of someone who was not going to be caught approving something he did not fully understand. Give me a week, he said. Take 2, Izuku said. I have school. Mora made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Izuku gathered his things and went home. The plan had moved from question to blueprint to first phase. The city did not know yet what was being built in its margins. It would not know for some time. But the foundations were there, invisible in the way that foundations always are, holding up nothing yet, waiting. Chapter 6, The Women the System Failed. While Izuku was 16 and building in the margins, 3 women in other parts of the country were also existing in the margins of the hero system, though their margins were differently shaped and arrived at through different paths. Rei Todoroki was living in the Hakodate psychiatric facility on a voluntary residential basis that had begun as involuntary but had shifted in legal designation without shifting in practical reality. She was 38. She had been there for 11 years. The windows of her room looked east over water and the light came in clean in the mornings, and she had learned to appreciate the mornings as a quantity of time that belonged entirely to her, which was a concept she had needed 11 years to fully internalize because the 38 years before the facility had not included much time that belonged to her. She had been a hero once. Or the beginnings of one, a young woman with an ice quirk of considerable power who had been recruited at 21 by a marriage that presented itself as a partnership and revealed itself, progressively, to be something else. Enji Todoroki, Flame Hero Endeavor, the number 2 ranked hero in Japan, did not discuss his wife in interviews because his wife was not a narrative element that served his public image. The children were sometimes discussed. Rei was not. She had ice in her veins in a literal sense and had learned, over the years in the facility, to think of this as something other than a liability. The cold did not hurt her the way it had once. It was just what she was. She thought about her children often. Shoto most of all, because Shoto had inherited both fire and ice from the deliberate combination that Enji had engineered, And this was a thought that Ray carried with the particular weight of something that is both grief and responsibility and which cannot be set down. She had received, some months ago, a letter from the Commission. It was bureaucratic in its phrasing and significant in its implication. Her voluntary residential status was being reviewed. The facility's administration had observed sufficient improvement in her condition that continued residential support might not be medically necessary. They would reassess in 6 months. Ray had read this letter 3 times. She understood it. The question it posed was not whether she could leave. It was what she would do if she did. Midnight, whose legal name was Namiri Kiyama and who was currently a member of the UA High Faculty and the most effective underground intelligence asset the Hero system had produced in the last 15 years, was sitting in a staff meeting that was in its 45th minute and showed no signs of concluding. Around her, her colleagues were producing the particular performance of engaged participation that institutional meetings required, and Namiri was producing this performance with her usual precision while running a second, private calculation behind her eyes. The calculation was simple in its structure and uncomfortable in its conclusion. She had been at UA for 7 years. She had been doing commission-adjacent work for most of that time, the kind that was officially unofficial, extracting information from people who would not provide it voluntarily and navigating social environments that required capabilities the Commission valued without wanting to formally acknowledge. She was very good at this work. She was also increasingly certain that the work was not making things better in the way it was supposed to. The system she served was not corrupt in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, a structure that had grown to serve its own perpetuation first and the ostensible purpose of hero society second. The Commission made decisions based on metrics that measured public confidence and hero licensing numbers and registered villain incidents, because those were the metrics that could be measured. The things that could not be measured, the cost of the human beings who moved through the system and came out diminished, the civilians who fell through gaps that the metrics did not track, the heroes who burned from the inside out trying to meet the demands of a system that treated them as functions, not people, did not appear in any report that the Commission reviewed. Namiri had a file of those things. She kept it in a private encrypted server. It was very long. The meeting ended. She gathered her things and walked to her classroom and stood in front of 30 students who were learning to be the next generation of the same system she was privately auditing, and she taught them with full sincerity because the students were not the system and they deserved better than to inherit it unprepared. Inko Midoriya was not a hero. She had a weak telekinetic quirk that could attract small objects and which she had never used for anything more significant than retrieving dropped items across short distances. She was 37. She was a single mother. She worked part-time at a local community center and had for years organized support groups for the parents of quirkless children and the parents of low-quirk children and later, as her understanding of the system grew, for the parents of children whose quirks had been assessed and dismissed and who had encountered the particular cruelty of a society that evaluated children by a metric they had not chosen. She was, without any formal authority or institutional recognition, one of the most effective community organizers in Mizutofu. She was also the mother of Izuku, and this meant that she had been watching, for 16 years, the development of a person who was doing something she could not fully understand but which she recognized with a mother's precision as significant. She did not know the details of the workshop. She did not know the scope of the plan. She knew that her son came home late on Tuesdays and Thursdays and all day Saturdays with oil under his fingernails and a quality of focused satisfaction in his eyes that she had not seen in him since he was 4 years old and filling his 3rd notebook. She bought better oil soap. She made dinner at irregular hours to accommodate his schedule. She did not ask questions he would answer obliquely. She waited, with the patient skill of a woman who had been learning a particular child for 16 years, for him to be ready to tell her. 3 women. 1 boy with notebooks and plans and hands that were becoming very good at building things. The city of Mizutofu did not know any of them were building toward the same eventual point. The hero system did not know. The Commission, which tracked hero licensing and villain incidents and public confidence metrics, did not know. The foundations do not announce themselves. Chapter 7, The First Machine That Changed Everything. Izuku was 17 when he built the device that ended the workshop phase and began the next one. He called it, in his notebooks, the conductor. He did not give things dramatic names as a rule, but this one had required it because the name was functional. The device conducted energy across materials in a way that should not have been possible given what was currently understood about the interaction between artificial electromagnetic structures and biological quirk generation matrices. The theory had been sitting in one of his notebooks for 2 years. He had developed it from first principles, starting from a foundational question that the academic literature had not addressed directly: if quirks were biological phenomena that operated through a modified version of the body's own electromagnetic signaling pathways, was there a structural way to interface external technology with those pathways without requiring neural direct contact? The academic answer, as far as Izuku could determine, was that this had not been seriously attempted because the intersection of biological quirk theory and electromagnetic engineering was a cross-disciplinary gap that neither field had found reason to bridge. Izuku bridged it. It took 8 months of iteration and 2 complete theoretical rebuilds and a 3-week period during which he was convinced he had made a fundamental error in the underlying physics and ate almost nothing because eating required cognitive resources he needed elsewhere. Inko, during this period, left food outside his door and did not comment on the state of the room. He had not made a fundamental error. He had made 3 small errors that compounded, and when he found all 3 and corrected them, the theory became clean in the way that correct theories become clean, the way structure resolves when the right explanation is found and everything that seemed like complication becomes consequence. The conductor, at its simplest, was a wearable device that could read a user's quirk generation frequency in real time and amplify, redirect, or stabilize that frequency through an external electromagnetic scaffold. It did not require the user to consciously modify their own power output. It operated at the system level, the way a hearing aid did not require conscious amplification but simply corrected the underlying signal. The implications were not small. A hero with a strength amplification quirk that produced inconsistent output, fatigue-dependent and difficult to control in high-stress situations, could use the conductor to stabilize their output at a consistent level regardless of physical state. A hero with a perception quirk that caused chronic sensory overload could use it to apply precise filtering without suppressing the quirk entirely. A hero with a developing quirk that had not fully matured, the kind of quirk that UA students spent years learning to manage because the management was done through will and training rather than through any external support, could use it to access levels of precision and control that would otherwise take a decade to achieve. What Izuku had built, in the workshop on the edge of Naruhata, was a device that made people better at what they already were. Mora sat with the first functional prototype for a long time. He was not an expressive man but he was a precise one, and his expressions, when they appeared, were reliable indicators of internal states that he did not otherwise communicate. His expression now was the one Izuku associated with a number being revised substantially upward. "This changes things," Mora said. "Yes. The commission will want this." "Yes. You're not going to give it to them." Izuku looked at the prototype. It sat in its test cradle and hummed with a frequency that he could feel in the bones of his hands when he held it. "I'm not going to give it to the commission," he said. "I'm going to use it to pay for the next phase." The next phase was land. A specific piece of land that Izuku had been researching for 18 months, on the boundary of Muzidafu's industrial district and an older residential zone that had been declining for years and which the city had been trying to sell for slightly longer than Izuku had been studying it. It was large. It had existing structures, none of them current, all of them structurally sound in ways that the official assessment undervalued because the official assessment was written by someone who did not understand materials engineering. It was, in other words, a foundation. "You need a legal identity to buy land," Mora said. "I'll be 18 in 4 months. And I have been setting up the corporate structure for 2 years." Izuku opened his notebook to the relevant section and turned it so Mora could read it. Mora read it. He read it twice. He set the notebook down with the careful movement of a man handling something that had become, in the act of reading, heavier than it appeared. "You have been setting this up since you were 15. "Since I was 15 and 3 months, Izuku said. "After I understood what the workshop could prove about the technical feasibility. I did not want to design the structure until I was certain the technical foundation was real." "And now you're certain." Izuku picked up the conductor and held it in both hands. The hum moved through his palms and up his arms, and there was no quirk in him for it to interact with, but it seemed to recognize the frequency of his attention anyway, the particular electromagnetic signature of a mind that had been pointed at a single large problem for 3 years and had not looked away. Now I'm certain, he said. He set it back in the cradle. He closed the notebook. He gathered his things in the efficient way he had developed over 2 years of workshop evenings, and he said goodnight to Mura, and he went out into the Narahata night. The city was alive with the apparatus of hero society, the distant lights of an agency building, the blue signature of commission-registered hero communication infrastructure on a nearby rooftop relay, the sound of an emergency broadcast from a phone somewhere down the street. All of it ran on premises that Izuku had spent his formative years examining. He walked home through it. He was 17 years old and 4 months from 18, and the plan was no longer a plan. It was a construction schedule. He had a lot of work to do. Chapter 8, The Purchase. The morning after his 18th birthday, Izuku Midoriya submitted a purchase offer for the Lot 7 Industrial Residential Boundary Zone, North Muzutafu, through a registered legal entity called Midori Technical Systems, which had been a dormant shell corporation for almost 3 years and was now, as of 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, active. Inko made breakfast while he submitted the paperwork on his laptop at the kitchen table. She set a plate of tamagoyaki in front of him and poured tea and sat down across from him and watched him complete the process with the calm of someone who had prepared themselves for this moment and was not going to let it arrive without appropriate ceremony. He looked up when he was done. "Mom," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been working on this for 3 years. I know. I should have told you sooner." She looked at him with the full attention she had been giving him his entire life, the kind of attention that sees not the surface of what someone is doing but the shape of what they are becoming. "You told me when you were ready to tell me," she said. "I was watching the whole time." He had told her the week before. Not a summary. The full account, the workshop, the plan, the conductor, the corporate structure, the land. He had done it on a Sunday evening at the same table with his notebook stacked in front of him, prepared to answer every question she had, and she had asked very few of them because she was not someone who needed to be convinced by argument when she could read her son's face. Her primary response had been practical. She had asked about legal liability. She had asked about the network's reliability. She had asked about the land's access to public utilities and whether the existing structures were genuinely sound or whether he was reading the assessment through the lens of what he wanted to see. He had good answers for all of these. She had accepted them. Then she had said, "I want to be involved." He had not expected this. His face had done something that he was aware reflected surprise in a way he did not fully manage to suppress, and she had looked at his surprise with a very slight expression that he recognized as the one she wore when he had underestimated her. "You are building a place," she said. "A place needs someone who understands how communities work. I have been running community support programs for 9 years. I know how people organize. I know what people need when they are trying to live somewhere new and build something that is not part of the existing system." She paused. "You know machines. You do not know people the way I know people." This was accurate and he knew it. "I know," he said. "Then I'm coming with you." He had not found a reason to argue. Sitting now at the kitchen table on his 18th birthday, offer submitted, the purchase process officially in motion, he was glad he had not tried. The offer was accepted 11 days later at a price 20% below listing because Izuku had documented the 3 ways in which the city's property assessment had overvalued the remediation costs and submitted this documentation to the seller's agent, which had the effect of making a negotiated reduction feel like a mutual recognition of facts rather than a demand. He began construction in the spring. The first structure he built was a workshop. Obviously. But unlike the borrowed spaces of the past 3 years, this one was designed from scratch around his specific requirements: materials, power, ventilation, workspace flow, storage capacity. He designed it the way he had designed the conductor, from first principles with attention to every interaction between components, and the result was a building that worked the way his best devices worked. Mura walked through it the first week and said nothing for 20 minutes. Then he said, "I'm moving in." "There's a residential unit in the eastern structure," Izuku said. "It's basic right now." "Basic is fine," Mura said. Basic is better than what I have. The network began to follow. 3 engineers in the first 6 months, drawn by Moore's descriptions of the workshop and the practical benefit of a workspace that was better equipped than anything they had been using. Then a materials specialist. Then 2 programmers who had been doing their best work on a shared server rented from a company that had no idea what they were using it for. Inko organized the residential side. She set up the basic administration, the shared resource management, the protocols that allowed a small community of technically brilliant and socially variable people to function without everyone hating each other by month 3. She did this with the quiet competence she had developed over 9 years of community organizing, making it seem effortless in the way that genuine expertise always makes its underlying complexity invisible. By the end of the first year, there were 14 people living and working in the compound. None of them were heroes. None of them were criminals. All of them were building something. The hero industry moved through the city around them, indifferent, full of itself. The compound kept building. Chapter 9, The Armor of New Things. In the second year, Izuku built the armor. It had been in his notebooks for a long time, sketched in the margins of other projects, the idea developing in the gaps between more immediate work. The conductor had established the theoretical foundation. External technology could interface with biological quirk systems at the frequency level, enhancing, stabilizing, or redirecting natural capabilities. The next logical application was a full-body integration platform, a system that wrapped the user in engineered capability the way that the old myths wrapped their heroes in divine favor. Not for him. For someone with a quirk to amplify. He designed it in iterations, testing structural and electromagnetic subsystems separately before attempting integration. The first complete prototype was uncomfortable and heavy and had a power management system that ran too hot. The second was better. The third was the first version he would have been willing to call finished, if he had ever been willing to call anything finished. It was not the heavy industrial aesthetic of commissioned standard hero support gear. It was something different. The proportions were precise, the surface designed to channel and distribute electromagnetic load rather than simply absorb impact. It moved with the wearer rather than around them. The integrated conductor layer meant that anyone wearing it had their quirk frequency read and optimized in real time, an ambient enhancement that required no conscious engagement from the user. Put this on someone with an ice quirk, the thought surfaced one evening while he was in the workshop alone after everyone else had gone to bed. And you would have a person whose control was absolute. Whose range was extended. Whose power output was consistent regardless of their physical or emotional state. He wrote this in his notebook. He did not know, at that moment, whose ice quirk he was thinking about. The thought came before the person it would eventually fit. He continued refining the design. The compound grew around this work. The second year added a secondary workshop for the materials team, a greenhouse structure that one of the programmers had proposed as a project and which Inko had immediately supported because she understood that people living in compound structures needed things that grew, a proper power generation system that Izuku had been designing in parallel with the armor and which went online in month 18 and produced, from a combination of engineered solar collection and a modified thermal exchange system, enough power to run all compound operations independently of the city grid. The day the compound went off-grid, Inko stood in the courtyard and looked at the power display panel and then looked at her son. "We're independent," she said. "For power," Izuku said. "We still have grid connections as backup. And the water supply is municipal." "That's the next phase." She nodded. She did not ask for a timeline. She had learned that asking for timelines produced accurate answers that were long and detailed and that what she actually wanted to know was simpler: was it going well? She could read the answer to that question in him directly, in the quality of his focus and the way he moved through the compound, and the answer, increasingly, was yes. It was going well. The work was going well. The compound was growing. The conductor had generated enough revenue through network sales to fund Phase 2 entirely, and Phase 3 was already designed, waiting only for the time that Phase 2 would take to complete. Something was being built. It was not finished. It was not yet the city that the plan had always been pointed toward, but it was undeniably real. And it was growing. And the foundations were solid. Chapter 10, The Invitations. In the 4th year, Izuku began sending letters. He was 21. The compound had evolved past the point where the word compound felt accurate. It was more than a collection of workshops and residential units. It was a functioning small community with its own internal logistics, its own shared infrastructure, its own culture shaped by the people who had chosen to be there. 34 people lived and worked in the zone. Several of them had families. The greenhouse had expanded. There was a shared kitchen. There was, because of a particularly insistent programmer named Suda, a small library that Izuku had stocked from his own collection and which had since been expanded by everyone else's. Inko ran the community administration with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it informally for years and was simply now doing it formally. She had her own office. She had, at some point that Izuku could not precisely identify, become the person that everyone in the compound went to when they needed something other than technical help, which meant that she was now as central to its function as he was, and in ways that were harder to replace. He had thought about this. He had thought about the kind of place the compound was becoming, and the kind of place he had always intended it to become, and the gap between the two was smaller than he had expected at this stage. He had also been thinking about the armor. Not as an abstract engineering project any longer. As an offer. As a thing that he could extend to people whose lives had been shaped by a system that had taken what they were and used it for purposes that were not their own, and who might want something different. He had 3 specific people in mind. He had been thinking about them for 2 years. He had done, characteristically, an enormous amount of research. The first letter went to Hakodate. It was addressed to Rei Todoroki, and it was not long. He had written it 18 times before arriving at the version he sent. The earlier versions were too technical, too detailed, too full of the compound's capabilities and too sparse on the thing that actually mattered, which was simpler and harder to say precisely. The final version said, in essence, I have built a place that does not belong to the system that hurt you. If you would like to know what it is, I would be glad to tell you. There is no obligation in reading this letter. There is no expectation attached to any response. He included a description of the compound. He included the location. He included, because he thought it was more honest than leaving it out, a brief description of who he was, a quirkless engineer who had built independent infrastructure because the existing system had made clear it was not interested in what he could offer. He signed it with his name and his title at Midori Technical, which was still a small company and which he was aware carried no weight with anyone who did not already know it. The second letter went to Namiri Kiyama at her personal address, which had required 6 weeks of careful work to locate. This one was longer because she was someone whose intelligence required a more complete argument, not less. He laid out what the compound was and what it was becoming. He described the armor. He described the principle behind it, that the hero system had taken people with extraordinary capabilities and organized those capabilities around the Commission's requirements, and that this was not the only possible organization. He did not insult the hero system. He described it accurately, which had the same effect. He invited her to visit. No commitment. No pressure. A visit, if she was curious. The third letter did not go anywhere. The third letter he left on the kitchen table one morning before Inko was awake, with a cup of tea that he made and left beside it because she drank tea when she read things that mattered, and he knew this about her the way she knew everything that mattered about him. When she came down and found it, she sat at the table and read it and held the tea and was quiet for a long time. He was upstairs. He was pretending to be asleep. He was not asleep. She came to his door after a while and knocked once and opened it. He was sitting on his bed with his notebook open and he looked up at her and they looked at each other in the way they had always been able to, where the surface communication was sparse because the underlying frequency was clear. You want me to stop being the administrator, she said, and be something else. I want you to be both, he said. What you are here, for the community. And something that uses the armor. Something that means you are never again in a position where your safety depends on a system that does not see you. She was quiet again. Her eyes were doing what they did when she was thinking carefully about something she felt strongly about, the two processes running in parallel, each checking the other. You built the armor, she said slowly, thinking about me. He realized, yes. Not only her. But the thought that had come to him that late evening in the workshop, about an ice quirk and absolute control and consistency regardless of emotional state, had come with her face behind it. He had not acknowledged this consciously until this moment. Among others, he said. But you first. She crossed the room and put her hands on his face in the way she had done since he was 4 years old on the day of the diagnosis, and she sat beside him and she said, yes. He closed his notebook. Outside the compound walls, the city moved in its established patterns, indifferent, enormous, full of the apparatus of a system that had not yet noticed what was being assembled in its margins. The letters were sent. The answers would come. The compound waited, growing, as compounds do, until the word for them becomes something larger. The Tech God of Mizutofu. A serialized fanfiction. Act 2. The Women Who Answered. Act 2. The Women Who Answered. Chapter 11. The Letter in Hakodate. Rei Todoroki received the letter on a Friday morning in the second week of October, 4 years into her voluntary residency at the Hakodate facility, which meant 4 years and 7 months since the day the legal designation had changed on paper without changing very much in practice. The mail arrived at the facility in a small basket that the morning staff set on the table in the East Common Room, the one with the good window that faced the water. Most mornings there was nothing for Rei. She did not have many correspondents. Shoto wrote, when his schedule at UA permitted, letters that were careful and a little formal because he had been taught formality before he had been taught warmth and he was still negotiating the distance between them. Fuyumi wrote more frequently and more personally, in a hand that was hurried and full of the kind of life detail that suggested she was trying to build a picture for Rei of an ordinary world she could return to. Natsuo did not write but sent photographs sometimes, clipped to a half-page of caption that described each one with a rough humor that Rei recognized as the way he moved through things that were difficult for him. She had not received a letter from someone she did not know since she had arrived. She took the letter to the window and sat in the chair that was hers by habit and long possession and looked at the envelope for a moment before opening it. The return address was a compound location in Mizutofu that she did not recognize. The name was Midoriya Izuku. The corporate designation beneath the name was Midori Technical Systems, which she also did not recognize. She opened the envelope with the careful movements she had developed for handling things that might be significant. She had learned, over her years in the facility, to not rush significance. Rushing it produced errors of interpretation that were difficult to correct afterward. She read the letter once through. Then she set it in her lap and looked at the water. The water was doing what it always did at this hour, catching the morning light in a way that distributed it into moving pieces, each one slightly different from the last. She had spent a great deal of time watching water in this facility and had developed a particular appreciation for the fact that it was never the same configuration twice, which was something she found steadying in a way that she had never fully articulated. She read the letter again. A quirkless engineer. A compound built outside the Hero Systems infrastructure. An independent power grid, independent operations, a community of people who had chosen to work in a space the Commission had not organized. An armor designed to interface with quirk biology at the frequency level, to stabilize and extend and make consistent what the body naturally did, without requiring the conscious effort of suppression or control. She had spent 11 years practicing suppression and control. She was very good at it. She had also spent 11 years aware of the cost of that practice, the energy it required, the way it pulled inward instead of outward, the way it turned her power into something she managed rather than something she inhabited. The letter did not promise anything dramatic. It described a visit. A conversation. The freedom, stated plainly, to leave without consequence. Rei looked at the letter for a long time. Outside the window, the water moved. A boat crossed the middle distance, heading south. The morning light shifted as the season pulled at it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope and went to speak with her attending physician. The attending physician, Dr. Maki, was a woman in her 50s who had been Rei's primary clinician for 3 years and who had the quality of attention that Rei associated with people who had chosen their work for reasons that were not simple. She listened to Rei describe the letter without interrupting and without the particular careful blankness that some physicians adopted when a patient brought them unexpected information. And what is your response to reading it? Dr. Maki said. Ray considered. Cautious, she said. But interested. What makes you cautious? I have learned to be cautious about situations that seem to offer things that other situations did not. She paused. I have experience with environments that presented themselves as safe and were not. And what makes you interested? Ray was quiet for a moment. He wrote that the system had made clear it was not interested in what he could offer. And that he had built something outside of it. She looked at her hands. They were cool, always cool, the quirk expressing itself in her peripheral circulation in a way that was not uncomfortable but was constant. I understand that feeling. The part about the system not being interested. Dr. Maki nodded. You are technically free to travel, she said. Your voluntary status means a day trip or an overnight visit does not require administrative approval. It requires only that you inform us of your plans and that you return as agreed. I know, Ray said. Would you like me to review the letter? No, Ray said. Thank you. I wanted you to know that I'm considering going. She returned to the East Common Room and wrote a response. It was shorter than the original letter. She thanked him for writing. She said she was interested in a visit. She asked for a date that would work. She sealed it and put it in the outgoing basket and went to her room and sat on her bed and put her hands on her knees and felt the quiet cold in them and thought about what it might mean to wear a thing that made the cold something other than something to be managed. She thought about it for a long time. Then she got up and went to lunch. Chapter 12, The Pro-Hero and the Inconvenient Truth. Namiri Kiyama received Izuku's letter on a Wednesday morning between her second period class and a staff meeting that she had already decided to attend in body only. She had collected her mail at the front desk of her apartment building on her way out that morning and had carried it, unread, to UA in her bag, which was what she always did with personal mail because the morning commute was not her preferred reading time and because she had learned, over years of commission-adjacent work, the value of reading certain categories of correspondence in spaces where she could respond to it with her full attention rather than with half of it allocated to traffic. She opened it in her classroom after the students had filed out, sitting on the edge of her desk with the window behind her and the morning light coming in sideways and the distant sounds of UA's training facilities providing the ambient texture of an institution that never fully quieted. She read it in the way she read everything, fast on the first pass for content, slower on the second for implication, and then slower still on the third for what was not being said and why. The letter was precise. It did not overstate. This was the first thing she noted because overstatement was the default register of people who wanted something from her, and she had developed extensive experience distinguishing between the two. It described the compound accurately and with appropriate acknowledgement of what it was not yet. It described the conductor and the armor in technical terms that were specific enough to be credible and not specific enough to be verifiable without actually seeing them, which was a correctly calibrated balance for a first approach to someone with her intelligence background. It described the commission honestly, which meant it described a system with institutional inertia and outcome metrics that did not adequately weight the cost of the humans who moved through it. It did not say anything inflammatory. It did not need to. Namiri put the letter on her desk and looked at the wall for a moment. The wall had, on its left side, the licensing credentials that UA required all faculty to display. She had been licensed for 12 years. She had operated in 3 different official capacities across that time and in one unofficial one that was not on the wall and had no physical documentation because that was the nature of unofficial capacities. The unofficial work had taken her, in the past 4 years, into a comprehensive and involuntary education in the structural gap between what the hero system presented to the public and what it actually produced. She had documented this education in her private encrypted server. The file was long. She had not known what to do with the file. That was the honest answer. She had not known, when she started compiling it, what the end use of that information would be. The possibilities available to her within the system were limited. She could report to commission oversight, which was itself a commission function with self-preservation incentives. She could leak to press, with the associated professional and legal exposure. She could continue to document and do nothing, which was what she had been doing for 2 years and which had the virtue of safety and the considerable disadvantage of producing no change. And then a letter arrived from a 21-year-old quirkless engineer in Muzidafu who had read the architecture of the system as clearly as she had and had responded to the reading by building something outside of it. She put the letter in her bag. She attended the staff meeting. She participated in it with her usual precision and concealed the entire parallel calculation she was running behind it, which she was very good at. After the meeting she went to the training hall and put her power through its paces for an hour, which was how she thought when her mind needed to work faster than sitting at a desk aloud. The sleep quirk, somnambulist, was not a flashy power. It worked through pheromone distribution and required precision of delivery and range management that she had spent her entire career calibrating. It was also, she was objectively aware, extremely dangerous in the right context, far more dangerous than its rating on the official assessment scale suggested, because official assessment scales were designed to measure what was visible. She thought about the armor. She thought about what it would mean to have a platform that stabilized her pheromone distribution at the frequency level, that removed the fatigue variable, that extended her effective range without requiring her to consciously push against her own biological limits. She thought about what she could do with that. She went home. She sat at her desk. She opened her laptop. She spent 2 hours researching Midori technical systems, which had a very thin public profile, almost nothing in the official commercial registry beyond its registration date and legal address. The absence of a public profile was itself data. Companies that were not trying to attract investors or clients did not build public profiles. She found, through the less official channels she had access to, a broader picture, whisper market circulation of unlicensed support items of exceptional quality, a network of engineers with known professional affiliations to former commission-adjacent research programs, property registration on the North Muzidafu boundary zone. She found no criminal record for anyone associated with it. She found no commission flags. She found no villain affiliations. She found, in the gaps between what was recorded and what was not, the consistent profile of an operation that was not hiding but was simply not advertising, which was a different and more interesting thing. She wrote a reply that was shorter than the letter had been, which was intentional. She said she would visit on the first available weekend. She said she had questions that a letter was not the right medium for. She left the sign-off neutral. She sent it. She sat back. She thought about the file on her encrypted server and what it was for and whether this was what it was for. She did not have an answer. But she had a date. Chapter 13, The First Visit. Midoriya arrived first, on a Saturday in November, at 11 in the morning. She came in a personal vehicle rather than hero transport, in civilian clothes, without the costume or the designation, because she was here as a person and not as a pro-hero, and she wanted to establish that clearly from the first moment. She had noted the address from the letter and found it on a map and driven herself, which she rarely did, because the drive gave her 20 minutes of private thinking time and she had used all of it. The compound gate was not impressive. It was functional, reinforced, clean, fitted with a camera system she recognized as custom-built because no commercial installation she knew had that particular housing configuration. She pressed the call button and gave her name. The gate opened. She drove in. The interior was not what she had expected, and she had expected quite a lot because she had spent considerable time trying to construct an accurate expectation. It was larger than the land registry had suggested, because several structures had been built inward, expanding usable space without expanding the external perimeter. It was clean in a way that was not decorative but functional, every surface serving an identifiable purpose. There were people moving through the open spaces between buildings, not many, maybe 8 or 9 visible from where she parked, and they moved with the efficiency of people who were doing things rather than performing the doing of things. There was a greenhouse. There was a library building, small but clearly purpose-built. There were power generation structures along the northern boundary that she identified as significantly more sophisticated than commercial solar, something custom. The output distribution system alone was unlike anything in current commercial production. She was standing next to her car, still taking it in, when he came to meet her. Midoriya Izuku was not what she had assembled from the letter and the background research. She had expected someone older presenting, the way people who were very capable and who knew it often were. He was 21 and looked it, The green hair was in need of a trim, the clothes were functional to the point of being decisions rather than choices, the eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses were the particular green of old moss and moved over her with a quality of attention she recognized because she had trained herself to have it and did not often encounter it in others. He was cataloging her the way she was cataloging the compound. She appreciated the honesty of it. "Kayama-san," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Midoriya-kun," she said. "You have a more impressive operation than your corporate registration suggests." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more the recognition that the conversation had established an accurate baseline. "That's the intent," he said. "Would you like to start with the technical facilities or the residential?" "Technical," she said. "I want to understand what you've built before I understand how people live in it." He nodded and walked her through the workshop complex first. The workshop was where the letter's description and the reality diverged most significantly, but in the direction of reality being larger. The main workshop had the dense functionality of a space that had been designed by someone who understood workflow, everything at hand distance, materials organized by use sequence rather than category, the air quality managed by a ventilation system with custom particulate filtering that she noted because she was aware of what kinds of materials produced what kinds of particulates. He showed her the conductor first. He placed it on the central bench and explained it without condescension and without simplification, assuming a technical baseline from her that was approximately correct given her hero career and her private research. She asked 4 questions. He answered them in the order she had ranked them internally by importance, which was either coincidence or an accurate read of her priorities. She suspected the latter. Then he showed her the armor. It was in a separate room off the main workshop, a space that was clearly designed for fitting and testing rather than manufacturing. The armor stood on a display frame and was not the kind of thing she associated with hero support gear, which was almost always built to signal capability through its visual weight. This was precise. The proportions were exact in a way that suggested the designer had started from biomechanical first principles rather than from aesthetic conventions. The surface had the particular quality of something that had been iterated to its current state rather than designed in a single session. She stood in front of it for a while. "The integrated conductor layer," she said. "It reads my quirks frequency continuously?" "Continuously. It adjusts in real time. The latency is under 4 milliseconds, which is below the threshold of conscious perception. And for a pheromone distribution quirk specifically. The distribution mechanism in the armor's external layer is designed to enhance dispersal pattern control. You would have precise directional management of your range rather than the hemispherical distribution that your quirk naturally produces. You could target a specific individual in a crowd without affecting the people around them." She was quiet for a long moment. She had been working toward that level of precision for her entire career and had approached it through training but had never fully achieved it because the biological mechanism was not, at its root, a precision instrument. "How long have you been designing for my quirk specifically?" she said. 18 months, he said. "Once I understood the conductor's capability, I started designing configurations for specific quirk types." "You were the third." He paused. "The first was my mother. She has a weak telekinetic. The second was Rei Todoroki." "Ice. You've been thinking about a group," she said. "Not a question. I've been thinking about people who deserved better than what the system gave them," he said. "And what it would look like to offer them something different." She turned away from the armor and looked at him directly. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one," he said. She believed him, which was interesting because she did not believe most people and had extensive practice in the distinction. "Show me the rest of the compound," she said. He did. He walked her through the power generation system and explained the engineering in the way someone explains something they love, which was not a performance but a natural consequence of genuine understanding. He walked her through the residential section, where Inko Midoriya appeared from the administrative office and introduced herself with the warm competence of someone who ran things well and knew it without needing to perform that knowledge. Namuri liked Inko immediately. This was not something she said, because she was not someone who said things like that, but she filed it as important data. They had lunch in the shared kitchen with 6 compound residents who did not make any particular effort to impress her, which was itself impressive. The conversation ranged across materials engineering and urban infrastructure and a debate between two programmers about the most efficient approach to distributed power management that Namiri followed without participating in, and which told her more about the culture of the compound than any deliberate display would have. After lunch she asked to speak with Izuku alone. He took her to the library. It was, as she had noted from outside, purpose-built. The shelves were load-bearing elements of the wall structure, the lighting was designed for extended reading, the chairs were chairs that someone had chosen for comfort rather than appearance. She sat in one and he sat across from her, and she placed her hands on the table between them. "I have information," she said. "About the commission. About how the system operates in the spaces between its stated values and its actual behavior. I've been compiling it for 3 years and I have not known what to do with it because the available options within the system all have outcomes I find inadequate." He did not look surprised. He did not look excited. He looked at her with the attention she had already identified as his primary mode of engagement. "I'd like to hear it," he said. "If you're willing to share it. I want to understand first what you intend to do with it. Document it accurately. Use it to understand where the structural failures are so that what I'm building here addresses the right problems and not just the visible ones." He paused. "I'm not interested in destroying the hero system. I'm interested in building something that demonstrates a better model." "Those are different projects." She studied him. "You're 21, she said. "Yes. Most 21-year-olds building something outside the official system are doing it for reasons that are about them." "I know," he said. "I've thought about that. I've thought about whether the plan is about changing the system or about proving that I could have belonged to it and was wrong not to. I don't have a perfect answer. But I think the question I keep returning to is, does what I'm building help people who the current model fails? And if the answer is yes, the motivation behind it is secondary." She was quiet for a moment. The library was very still. Outside, the compound continued its quiet, efficient operations. "I'll share the file," she said. "And I'll come back. I'm not ready to make any larger commitment than that." "That's exactly the right amount of commitment for a first visit," he said. She left in the late afternoon, driving back through the city with the window down despite the November cold. She thought about the armor. She thought about the armor with her power inside it, her range precise instead of ambient, her delivery targeted instead of hemispherical. She thought about what she could do with information the Commission did not want made legible and a platform that the Commission could not touch because it existed outside the Commission's jurisdiction. She thought about the compound's library and the shared kitchen and the quality of the air in the workshop and the way Inko Midoriya had handed her tea without asking how she took it and had gotten it exactly right. She drove home. She sat in her apartment for a long time in the quiet. She had a date to come back. Chapter 14, Rei takes the train. Rei Todoroki had not been on a train alone in 11 years. This was a factual observation rather than an emotional one, or it began that way and became something else as she sat in the car heading south from Hakodate with her bag on her lap and the Hokkaido coastline moving past the window. She had traveled before, in the early years of the facility, always with an escort, always on routes that had been arranged by someone else. The train she was on now she had booked herself, 3 days ago, after receiving the date that Midoriya Izuku had suggested. She had bought the ticket herself at the machine in the Hakodate station. She had stood in front of the machine for longer than was necessary, not because she did not understand how to use it but because the act of using it was carrying more weight than it should have, which was something she was aware of and which she allowed herself to simply notice without attaching a judgment to it. She was wearing a light scarf that covered most of her throat and chin because the cold she carried externally was more pronounced in autumn, and she had learned that people in public spaces reacted to visible temperature anomalies around a human body in ways that created a tension she did not currently want. Beneath the scarf she was composed. She had the compact stillness of someone who had learned, very thoroughly, the practice of occupying herself without excess. The train journey was long. She read for part of it. She looked out the window for another part. She ate the lunch she had packed in the small bag and thought about Dr. Maki's questions and her own answers to them and whether the caution she had expressed was still proportional to the situation as she currently understood it. She had done her own research, in the weeks between the letter and the visit. Not the kind of research a former hero with intelligence resources would do, because she was not that, but the kind of research available to a person with a library card and an 11-year practice of reading carefully. Midori Technical Systems was thin in the public record. But the compound address was findable, and she had found one reference to it in a community notice from the Mitsuki local government, regarding a zoning application for expanded structures, which told her it was real. She had found a secondary reference in an engineering forum, a discussion of an unlicensed support item circulating in certain gray markets, that described performance characteristics consistent with what the letter had described. The thing that had decided her was simpler than the research. The letter had said, "I built something outside the system that was not interested in what I could offer." She had read this sentence many times. She had felt it with the precise resonance of someone who had spent 20 years being inside a system that had not been interested in her as anything other than what she represented to Enji Todoroki's project. She had been a quirk to be combined with his. She had been a wife and a household. She had been a mother in the biological sense and had been prevented from being one in the practical sense. She had never, in any of those roles, been asked what she could offer if the offering were entirely her own decision. The letter was asking, without quite saying so, exactly that question. She arrived in Mitsuki in the early afternoon and took a taxi from the station to the compound address. The compound gate opened before she pressed the call button, which meant either they had good cameras or they had been watching for her arrival, and she found she did not mind which. Inko Midoriya met her at the gate. This was unexpected. Rei had prepared herself to meet the young engineer, the person who had written the letter, and had assembled a version of that meeting in her mind. What she encountered instead was a woman in her late 30s with the particular warmth of someone who had developed it deliberately and then internalized it, who took Rei's bag from her hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who helped people carry things not as a gesture but as a natural act. "Todoroki-san," Inko said. "We're glad you came. You must be tired from the journey. Come inside and have tea first." The tea first protocol was so precisely calibrated to what Rei actually needed at that moment that she felt it as a small shock of recognition. She was tired from the journey. She was also managing, beneath the composure, the low-grade vigilance of someone entering an unfamiliar space, and the offer of tea before anything else was an offer of stillness, of being allowed to simply arrive before being asked to engage. "Thank you," Rei said. They sat in a small room off the shared kitchen that was clearly a receiving room of some kind, not formal, just quieter than the common spaces, with a window that looked into a courtyard where something green was growing in late autumn container planters. The tea was green and correctly temperature, and there was a small plate of simple sweets that Rei did not eat but that their presence acknowledged she might want. Inko did not fill the silence with talk about the compound. She asked about the journey. She asked, with the ease of someone who has managed many people and knows which questions open rather than close, whether Rei had traveled to Mitsuki before. They talked, simply, for 20 minutes. Rei felt the vigilance settle into something quieter. Then Izuku arrived. She recognized him from the context, younger than she had somehow expected despite knowing his age, carrying in his expression the quality she would come to associate with him, that particular focused attention that was not intrusive but was very complete. He greeted her with appropriate formality and then, apparently reading her accurately, did not immediately move to the technical presentation but sat down and accepted a cup of tea from his mother and asked about Hakodate. She told him about the water and the morning light. He listened with the same quality of attention he gave to everything else. After the tea, he showed her the workshop. She understood the conductor in outline within the first explanation and asked the technical question that went below the surface, not how it worked but why the frequency matching approach was more stable than a brute force amplification model. He answered this with a precision that told her the question had not surprised him, which told her he had expected her to ask it, which told her he had read her background research carefully. "Your quirk," he said, "is not one I have met before in my design work. Ice is interesting because it operates across two separate biological pathways, the temperature regulation and the crystalline structure generation. Most support items treat these as one system. They're not. The conductor can address them separately, which means you can have full stabilization of one without affecting the other." Rei looked at him. You can stabilize the temperature regulation pathway without amplifying the crystal formation. Yes. Or the reverse. Or both, independently tuned. She was quiet for a moment. 11 years of managing her own internal temperature against the pull of her quirk, the constant low-level work of keeping herself in a range that did not alarm the facility staff, the meditative practice she had developed to do this without conscious effort because conscious effort was not sustainable across a full day. The idea that a device could do that management for her, at the frequency level, without her having to think about it, was something she needed a moment to process. "May I see the armor?" she said. He took her to the fitting room. The armor designed for her was not the same as what she had imagined from the letter. It was white and silver, the color decisions clearly deliberate rather than default, the surface treatment something that was not quite metallic and not quite ceramic but absorbed light rather than reflecting it in a way that made the armor seem to exist at a slightly different density than the space around it. She stood in front of it for a long time. "The external temperature broadcast," she said. "You've accounted for the fact that my quirk radiates outward from my skin even at rest. The armor has a thermal management layer between the inner surface and the external shell. Your ambient temperature expression stays within the armor's thermal containment rather than broadcasting outward unless you want it to." "Unless I want it to," she repeated. "You have full control of what the armor expresses externally," he said. "Everything inside the system is yours to direct." She reached out and put her hand on the armor's surface. Even through the glove she wore she could feel the temperature of it, which was not cold, not warm, simply neutral, a material that did not impose a temperature of its own. A system that did not impose anything of its own. That simply made available what she already was. She turned to Izuku. He was watching her with that attention. Not pressuring. Waiting. "I would like to stay for the night," she said. "If there is a room. I would like to see more tomorrow before I return." "There is a room," he said. "We'll have dinner in an hour." "You should rest." She nodded. She took one more look at the armor, white and silver and waiting, and then she followed him out of the fitting room. She rested. She had dinner with the compound's residents, who did not treat her as either a patient or a celebrity, which was the two registers she had become accustomed to and which both carried, in their different ways, a category that was not quite her. Here she was simply a person at a table. She slept better than she had in months. Chapter 15, What Inko Knows. Inko Midoriya had always understood things about people before they understood those things about themselves. This was not a mystical gift. It was the accumulated consequence of 40 years of paying very close attention to the people she loved and a decade of professional practice and community support that had broadened the base population she paid close attention to. She understood, 3 days after Rei Todoroki's visit, that Rei was going to come back. She understood this before Rei confirmed it with a second letter, before Izuku mentioned it over dinner, before any official communication arrived. She understood it from the way Rei had held her teacup during that first 20 minutes in the receiving room, and the way she had looked at the courtyard planters, and the particular quality of her stillness at the dinner table, which was not the stillness of someone enduring a situation but the stillness of someone who had found, tentatively, a situation that did not require enduring. She understood, similarly, things about Namuri Kiyama from the single visit report Izuku had given her and the brief meeting Inko had facilitated that day. She understood that Namuri was someone who had been operating in 2 registers for a long time, the visible professional one and the private analytical one, and that the cost of maintaining that dual register had been significant and was not something she discussed. She understood that Namuri trusted carefully and verified everything and that the verification process, not the trust itself, was where she could be reached. Inko kept these understandings to herself. She did not offer them to Izuku as analysis. He was very good at the technical dimensions of what was being built and she was very good at the human dimensions and they had learned, without discussing it explicitly, to respect the division. What she was less certain about, and what she thought about on the evenings she sat in her office after the administrative work was finished and the compound had settled into its nighttime rhythm, was the shape of what was being assembled. She had read the letter he had written her, the one left beside the teacup that morning. She had read it as a mother and as the person who ran this community and as, increasingly, something that did not have a clean category, A woman who was being offered armor and agency by her own son and who was trying to hold all of those dimensions simultaneously without the weight of any one of them collapsing the others. The armor he had built for her was designed around her telekinetic quirk. Weak, the official assessment had always said. Low range, low payload, minimal combat application. She had been told this so many times and with such institutional confidence that she had internalized it, used it as a metric for the entire category of her own capabilities, and arranged her life around an understanding of herself as someone with a modest quirk who would not have hero applications. Izuku had explained, the evening he told her about the letter she would receive the next morning, what the conductor layer did to a telekinetic expression. Range was a function of focus and biological signal strength. The conductor could amplify the biological signal without requiring the conscious focus, which meant the range was no longer determined by effort. The payload, similarly, was a function of sustained frequency, and the conductor could sustain that frequency at a level she could not maintain biologically for more than a few seconds. What does that mean in practice? She had asked. In practice, he had said carefully, it means the payload ceiling is not what anyone has assessed. The assessment was done on your unaugmented biological output. The augmented output is different in kind, not just degree. She had understood what he was not quite saying. How different? He had shown her the projections. She had looked at them for a long time. He had not said anything while she looked. The projections described a range of approximately 2 kilometers under conductor amplification. A payload that, at peak sustained output, was sufficient to move structural elements. Not small objects. Not dropped keys. Structural elements. She had been told for 40 years that she had a modest quirk with minimal applications. The projections described something categorically different. You've known this, she said. Not an accusation. A statement of what had become clear. I've known the theoretical projection for 18 months, he said. I wanted to build the armor before I told you, because theories without physical realization are not fair offers. She had looked at him across the table and felt something that required several minutes to identify. It was not surprise, exactly. She had known for years that Izuku saw things others did not. It was the specific sensation of being seen accurately after a very long period of being seen inaccurately, and the difference in those two experiences was larger than she had known until she felt it. Yes, she had said, which was the answer to the letter she had not yet read, and he had understood her. Now, 3 days after Rei's visit, sitting in her office in the evening, Inko thought about what they were assembling. 3 women, all of them carrying the particular history of people whom the hero system had processed without seeing. Herself with a quirk assessed as minor that was not minor. Rei with a power she had spent 11 years being required to suppress. Namiri with a career built on dual registers, never fully herself in either. And Izuku, building the armor and the compound and the infrastructure, quirkless in a world that had judged his entire potential by that single fact. She thought about what it meant that the person building the platform was someone who had never had a quirk to be seen through or exploited or assessed inadequately. He saw people clearly because he had never learned to see them through the filter that the hero system used, which sorted them by what power they manifested rather than what they were. She thought this was perhaps not incidental. She closed the office and walked through the compound in the dark, past the workshop lights still on because some of the engineers worked late, past the greenhouse where grow lights made a faint warm glow through the glass, past the library where she could see through the window a young programmer reading alone. The compound was alive even at this hour, in the quiet way that places are alive when the people in them are genuinely there, not performing occupancy but actually present. She went home to her apartment in the eastern residential block and made tea and sat by her window and watched the city beyond the compound walls. The city did not know what was being assembled here. Not yet. Chapter 16, The First Fitting. Inko's armor fitting happened on a Saturday in late November, in the fitting room that Izuku had designed specifically for the process. The room had good light and a full-length mirror and the armor on its frame and a set of tools arranged on a bench for the adjustments that every first fitting required because the human body's exact dimensions were always slightly different from the design phase measurements, however good the measurement process had been. Izuku had insisted on a thorough measurement session 2 weeks earlier, which Inko had submitted to with the same composure she brought to everything she did not fully understand but trusted the purpose of. The armor was green. Not the bright hero display green of publicity materials but the deep green of old copper or forest shade, a color that did not shout but had weight. It had the same precision of proportion as the others, the same absence of the visual excess she associated with commissioned standard hero equipment. It was, she thought, looking at it on its frame, unmistakably built for someone specific. The inner layer first, Izuku said. He was systematic about this, which she appreciated. He explained each component before she wore it and described what she would feel, so that nothing that happened during the fitting would be unexpected. The inner layer was light, far lighter than she had expected from the armor's external appearance. It conformed to her shape with a material intelligence that felt less like wearing something and more like being supported by something, a distinction she noted because it mattered. There was a warmth to it that was not temperature but something more like presence, the conductor layer beginning its baseline reading. You'll feel a low vibration, Izuku said. That's the conductor establishing your quirk frequency baseline. It takes about 40 seconds on first contact. She felt it. It was not unpleasant. It was the particular sensation of being attended to very precisely. Then the outer layer, piece by piece, the shoulders and the chest and the arms, and Izuku making small adjustments at each stage with the careful attention he brought to all physical work, not rushing, not performing efficiency but actually being efficient. The gauntlets last, and they fit with a precision that she felt as a kind of completeness, the armor forming around her until she was not wearing it so much as occupying it. She looked at herself in the mirror. She had not looked at herself in a full-length mirror in any meaningful way for a very long time. Not because mirrors were unavailable but because there had not been anything in particular to look for. The person in the mirror had been the person in the facility, managing, maintaining, being carefully fine. The person in the mirror now was wearing green armor that fit her exactly and which made her look not like a hero out of the commission mold but like something older, something that suggested the category of hero was a smaller version of something that this was. Try extending, Izuku said quietly. She extended her quirk. The difference was immediate and total. Her natural range, without the armor, reached perhaps 8 meters on a focused effort. With the conductor layer engaged, the reach extended outward like water filling a space, smooth and effortless, finding the edges of the fitting room and the workshop beyond it and the courtyard beyond that, and she felt all of it at once, the precise location of every object within an expanding sphere without any increase in the effort she was expending. She lifted the tool kit from the bench without looking at it. She set it down gently on the other bench. She could feel the weight of each individual tool within the kit without touching any of them. She looked at Izuku in the mirror. He was watching her the way he watched everything that was working correctly, not triumph, not relief, just the quiet satisfaction of someone seeing a correct result arrive on schedule. The theoretical projection, she said. 2 kilometers. That's the sustained output ceiling at current conductor calibration, he said. There's room to optimize further once we have real-world usage data. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She was 57 years old and she had spent most of her adult life believing a particular set of things about what she was and what she was capable of, and the person in the mirror was offering a different answer. She had been a mother, primarily. She had been a community administrator, secondarily. She had been a person with a modest quirk and a life organized around the needs of others. All of these things were true and she did not want to stop being them. But the person in the green armor, looking back at her from the mirror with the full reach of something that had always been inside her and had never been correctly seen, was also true. It fits, she said. Yes, he said. It does. She reached up and touched the surface of the chest plate with one hand. The material was smooth under her fingers and the conductor layer pulsed very gently in response to her touch, a system recognizing itself being touched. Thank you, she said. She was not referring to the fitting. He understood. You're welcome, he said. He was not referring to the fitting either. Chapter 17, Second Visits and Deeper Questions. Namuri came back the following Saturday, as agreed, and brought her encrypted server on a secured drive. This was not a small thing. She had carried the server for 3 years and had never shared it with anyone because the people she worked with were inside the system the server documented, and the people she trusted personally were not equipped for the information it contained, and she had existed in this particular form of isolation long enough that it had started to seem structural rather than circumstantial. She handed it to Izuku in the library after she had arrived and had tea and had gone through the second round of compound orientation that she had asked for, covering the sections she had not had time to fully examine on the first visit. He took the drive without ceremony and placed it on the table. "I'll need a week to go through it properly," he said. "I won't share it with anyone here without your explicit approval." "There is one person here I would approve," she said. "Your mother." He looked at her. "You've met her once. I've observed her twice. She runs this community. She is the person who would need to understand the structural context of what I've documented, because the structural context is about how systems treat people, and that is what she manages the consequences of." She paused. "And she is clearly not someone who uses information carelessly." "No," he agreed. "She's not." He showed her the armor for her second time, not for the overview but for the technical detail, the subsystems, and the calibration process and the communication infrastructure that connected the armor's onboard systems to the compound's central network. She asked better questions this time because she had spent the intervening week thinking about the first visit's answers. The communication infrastructure was something she had not anticipated. The armors were not isolated pieces of equipment. They were nodes in a network Izuku had been building in parallel with the physical compound, a communication and coordination system that operated on frequencies outside the Commission's monitoring bandwidth. "You built your own communication infrastructure," she said. "The compound needed communication systems that didn't route through networks I don't control," he said. "Once I had that architecture, extending it to the armor was a natural step. The Commission monitors hero communication frequencies as a matter of routine," she said. "I know. These don't appear in any frequency band they currently monitor. I had to develop the carrier protocol myself because nothing commercially available had the properties I needed." She was quiet for a moment. She was recalculating again, the same recalculation she had done the first time but starting from a higher baseline. "You've built a communication network that the Commission cannot intercept and an armor system that the Commission cannot access and a power infrastructure that the Commission cannot interrupt," she said. "Yes. And you're 21. "I'm aware of my age," he said, with the very slight dry quality she was beginning to recognize as his version of humor. She almost smiled. "The Commission will notice this compound eventually," she said. "They notice everything that falls outside their accounting." "I know. I've been modeling the timeline. The compound's current operational profile puts it below the threshold that triggers active investigation. Growing it past a certain scale will change that. I have about 2 years, maybe 3, before we need to have a different kind of conversation with the Commission." He looked at her directly. "That's one of the reasons I wrote to you. Your understanding of how the Commission processes information and where its institutional attention is focused is relevant to that timeline." She had suspected this was a component of why she had been invited. She had been deciding how she felt about it. She had concluded that she felt fine about it because it was honest, and honesty about the self-interested dimensions of an invitation was something she valued over honesty withheld in favor of a purer-seeming appeal. "What's the other reason?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because you've been paying the cost of what you know for 3 years and that's not sustainable," he said. "And because what you've documented deserves to be put somewhere it can do something." She held this for a moment. Outside the library window, the compound's courtyard was catching afternoon light, the container planters still with their late autumn greenery, the paths between buildings marked by the movement of compound residents going about their day. "Show me my armor," she said. He showed her. The armor designed for her was black with accents in a deep violet that was almost purple, almost charcoal, the color of something that operated in the space between visibility and its absence. It was appropriate in a way that felt intentional. She did not ask if it was intentional because she already knew it was. The fitting happened at her request, immediately. She did not want to look at it and go away and come back. She was done with that particular form of delay. The inner layer. The conductor baseline reading, 40 seconds of precise vibration. The outer layer. The gauntlets. She looked in the mirror. The armor fit her with the same exact quality as Inko's had fit Inko, which was the quality of something designed by someone who had started from the person rather than from an idea of what the person should be. It was not a hero costume. It was not commission standard anything. It was what she was, expressed in physical form by someone who had read her with significant care. Try your range, Izuku said. She released the pheromone layer at minimal output. The distribution was not the hemisphere she had always worked with, the ambient spread that she had learned to manage by controlling its radius. The armor's distribution system channeled it. She could feel the channel, precise and directed, like the difference between opening a valve and opening a nozzle. She directed it at the toolkit on the bench. Only the toolkit. Izuku was standing 3 feet from the toolkit. He did not react. The pheromones had reached the kit and stopped, channeled to a precision she had never come close to achieving without the armor. She withdrew the distribution. She looked at him. You didn't feel anything, she said. Nothing, he confirmed. She turned back to the mirror. The precision she had spent her entire career working toward and never fully achieving had just arrived in 40 seconds of fitting. She thought about her commission file. She thought about the file on her encrypted server and what it documented. She thought about 3 years of carrying something in a space between knowing and being able to act. I'll need a leave of absence from UA, she said. I'll apply for educational development leave, which is funded and which runs 6 months. After 6 months I'll need to make a different kind of decision. What kind of different decision, he said, behind her, in the mirror. Whether I'm still at UA, she said. Or here. The fitting room was very quiet. You have 6 months to decide, he said. There's no pressure on the timeline. No, she said. But I think I already know. She took off the armor with the same care with which she had put it on. She handed the pieces to Izuku one by one and he replaced them on the frame. Then she smoothed her civilian clothes and picked up her bag and they walked back through the compound in the late afternoon light. The compound was real and growing and the armor was real and waiting and the encrypted drive was on the library table with 3 years of documentation that had finally found a place to land. She drove home in the dark. Chapter 18, Rei makes a choice. Rei's second visit was longer than the first. She had arranged with Dr. Maki to be away for 4 days, which was the longest she had been outside the facility since the legal designation had changed. She had packed carefully, not extensively, and had taken the train south again, and this time she recognized the stations as they passed, which meant the journey was already less unfamiliar than it had been, which she logged as meaningful. Inko met her at the gate again. This time there was less of the receiving room protocol, not because it was unavailable but because Rei did not need it in the same way. She was less vigilant. The space was already partially known. She spent the first day doing very little of significance. She walked through the compound at her own pace without an agenda. She spent an hour in the greenhouse, which was operated by a quiet young man named Rika who grew vegetables and herbs and a variety of flowers that he claimed were for compound morale and which Rei suspected were also simply for their own sake, which she respected. She spent another hour in the library. She read part of a book she had not read before, a novel, and found herself actually inside it rather than performing the activity of reading, which was something she had not managed consistently in some years. She had dinner with Inko and 2 other residents who asked her questions about Hakodate with genuine curiosity and did not ask any questions about Enji Todoroki, which told her something about what the compound's culture expected of itself. On the second day she had the fitting. Izuku had told her on the first visit that the armor he had designed for her was white and silver, but that description had not fully prepared her for the actual object. The white of it was not the clinical white of facilities she knew. It was the white of particular winter light, of the water outside her window on clear mornings, the white of something that was cold in a way that was beautiful rather than frightening. She stood in front of it for a long time before he said anything. When you're ready, he said. No pressure in it. She put it on with his help and the conductor layer found her in 40 seconds and she felt it immediately, the temperature regulation, both pathways of her quirk read and addressed separately. The ambient chill that she always carried stopped at the inner surface of the armor rather than moving outward. She stood in the fitting room and for the first time in 11 years she was simply warm. Not the warmth of applied heat from an external source, not the warmth of being indoors in winter. Simply warm, because her own temperature was no longer being modulated outward. Because the thing she carried was being held within the system she was wearing. She did not cry. She was not going to cry. But she stood very still for a moment and let the sensation of it be what it was. Izuku said nothing. He waited. The crystalline generation pathway, she said, when she was ready. Show me what the augmentation does. He explained the controls that were built into the gauntlets, the gesture-based calibration system. She spent 45 minutes learning the gesture vocabulary, which was well designed, intuitive in the way that things designed by someone who had thought about the human hand were intuitive. Then she extended the ice. The first generation was controlled at half the conductor's amplification ceiling, which Izuku had specified for the initial test. The ice formed from the air's moisture in a crystalline structure that extended from her palms and spread across the floor of the fitting room in a pattern that was precisely what she had directed, not what her unaugmented quirk would have produced, which was a broader and less precise spread. The structure was intricate. The structure was exactly what she had intended. Full amplification, she said. We should go outside for that, he said. They went into the courtyard. It was mid-morning and cold, and the compound residents who were working in the outdoor spaces had been asked, she understood, to give the courtyard some clearance for this hour. The courtyard was the largest open space in the compound. It was not large by the standards of what she suspected her full output at conductor amplification would require. I'll stop you if anything looks like structural risk, Izuku said. He had a data pad that was reading the conductor's output metrics in real time. She looked at the courtyard. She calibrated. She released at full conductor amplification. The ice came outward from her in all directions. Simultaneously, the floor and 3 walls of the courtyard covered in a fraction of a second, the structures that extended from the ice intricate and large, taller than the courtyard walls, crystalline formations that caught the thin winter sunlight and distributed it in a way that turned the entire space into something that was not what it had been. She had been managing her quirk for 39 years. She had been managing it very carefully for the last 11, tamping it down, keeping it within the limits that the facility's physical structure and her own sense of safety required. She had not released at anything like her natural ceiling in over a decade. This was not her natural ceiling. This was her natural output amplified by a device designed by someone who had understood what her quirk was before she had, and the difference between what she had been working with and what she was capable of was so large that she stood in the middle of the courtyard she had just transformed and felt something she could not name, something that required standing inside it until it resolved into language. It resolved into this, she had not known. She had not known, all these years. The suppression she had practiced had been suppression of something that was not what she had believed it to be. The ice around her now, reaching the compound walls and continuing to form intricate structures on their surface, was her. It was what she was. And it was not dangerous or frightening. It was simply enormous and precise and utterly hers. She withdrew it gradually and the structures remained, beautiful and cold, because she allowed them to. Izuku was watching the data pad. Structural metrics on the compound buildings are nominal, he said. The courtyard floor held. He looked up. How are you? I'm fine, she said. And then, because it was more accurate, I'm very fine. The ice around her caught the morning light and was full of it, and the courtyard was changed from what it had been, and she stood at the center of the change she had made and understood that she was going to come back. Not for a visit. She was going to come back and stay. She would need to speak with Dr. Maki. She would need to speak with Shoto and Fuyumi. She would need to organize the things in her room and determine what to bring and what to leave. There was a process that had to happen, not quickly, but deliberately, because deliberate was the mode in which she was most reliable. But the decision was made. She had made it standing in the ice she had generated and surrounded herself with, which was the most complete statement she had made about anything in 11 years. I'll need a room, she said to Izuku. We have one, he said. Whenever you're ready. She looked at the ice formations around her. They would melt, of course. That was fine. That was what ice did when it had made its statement. She could always make more. Chapter 19, The Commission Takes Notice. The Commission's first formal attention to the compound came in the form of a regulatory inquiry letter addressed to Midori Technical Systems, dated 6 months after Rei's second visit and approximately 4 years and 2 months after the company's original registration. Izuku had been expecting it. He had been modeling the timeline and the models had been accurate. The inquiry was not an investigation. It was a compliance check, the kind of document that the Commission sent to entities in its peripheral vision that had not yet been formally categorized. The letter asked for documentation of all support item development activities, all personnel holding any form of hero-adjacent classification, and a structural description of the compound's operations. He called a meeting. The compound's decision-making process was flat in structure. Izuku set technical and infrastructural direction, Inko managed community function and personnel decisions, and on anything that affected the whole, there was a meeting. This was one of the things. Everyone who lived and worked in the compound knew it had been operating outside the normal Commission awareness framework. Everyone had understood, when they came, that this was a temporary state rather than a permanent one. The meeting was in the shared kitchen, which was the default large gathering space. 34 people, most of them engineers and technicians, a few administrators, Inko at the end of the table and Izuku standing because he always stood when he was running a meeting. The Commission has sent a compliance inquiry, he said. He read the letter to the room, directly, no editorializing. We have two options. The first is to respond with a standard filing, which establishes our operational profile in the Commission's formal record and may prompt follow-up inquiries. The second is to engage legal counsel and construct a response that establishes us formally as a non-hero support operation, which is the accurate description, and which has its own legal framework. What does non-hero support mean practically, said Suda, the programmer. It means we register as a private research and development organization with no official hero industry affiliation, Izuku said. Which is accurate. We have not filed any support item certifications. We have not filed any hero operational permits. The items we've distributed externally have gone through gray market channels that are a regulatory gray area, not a defined violation, but which I want to clarify in the filing. Clarify how, said Mura, from his usual seat near the far wall. By describing them as research prototypes distributed for ongoing field assessment, which is a classification that exists in the regulatory framework and which fits what they actually are. Izuku paused. What I do not want to do is describe the armor program in this filing. The armor program is not currently operational in any external context and is not subject to the Commission's support item certification requirements because no one wearing the armor is operating as a registered hero. This was accurate and everyone in the room knew it, and the particular way they knew it said something about the culture that had developed in 4 years. They were people who understood the regulatory framework clearly enough to know what it required and what it did not, and who were not going to misrepresent their operations but were also not going to volunteer information that was not being requested. The meeting resolved on the second option. Izuku filed a response 3 weeks later through legal counsel that established Midori Technical Systems formally as a private research organization, non-hero affiliated, operating within the relevant regulatory framework as a registered development entity. The filing was accurate and complete and revealed nothing it was not required to reveal. The Commission sent a receipt letter. They did not send a follow-up inquiry. Not yet. Mimuri, when Izuku showed her the inquiry and the response, read both twice and then looked at him with an expression that combined professional respect with something that was not quite alarm. You know this is temporary, she said. I know. I bought us approximately 18 months of reduced scrutiny. After that, we'll need to have progressed to a point where the compound has sufficient institutional presence that the Commission's calculation changes. What does sufficient institutional presence look like? A public demonstration, he said. Of what we can do. On our terms, in a context that establishes the compound's capability without giving the Commission a claim on the outcomes. She looked at him. You're talking about operating the armor publicly. I'm talking about operating it in a context that makes ignoring us more costly than engaging with us, he said. Those are different things. Ignoring is the Commission's preferred mode for anything outside their framework. I want to make the math of ignoring us change. She thought about this for a while. It was a very clean piece of strategic thinking. She had done strategic thinking professionally for 12 years and she could see the structure of it clearly. 18 months, she said. Approximately. Then we'd better get to work, she said. Chapter 20, the training ground. Ray moved into the compound on a Tuesday in February, arriving with 2 bags and a flat rectangular case that held, carefully wrapped, a small watercolor set that had been a gift from Fuyumi and which she had been unable to leave behind. Inko showed her to the room that had been prepared. It was in the eastern residential block, 2nd floor, with a window that faced the compound's interior courtyard. It was not a large room, but it had been arranged with care. The bed was positioned to receive morning light, the shelving was at a height that was correct for her, there was a small table by the window that was the right kind of table for sitting at in the early morning with tea. Ray stood in the room for a moment and then placed her bags on the bed and opened the smaller one and unpacked the watercolor set and put it on the table by the window. The table was put there yesterday, Inko said. Izuku noticed from the first visit that you had looked at the courtyard for a long time. We thought you might want to paint it. Ray looked at the table and the window and the courtyard below, which still had traces of the ice formations from her second visit's full output test, frozen into the courtyard surface by subsequent cold nights and too low to melt until a proper warm front came through. Yes, she said. I think I will. The first week in the compound was structured around orientation rather than training. Inko managed this with the expertise she brought to all community integration, showing Ray how the shared systems worked, introducing her to the residents whose paths she was most likely to cross regularly, building the fabric of daily life in the compound around her with enough structure to be stable and enough flexibility to be inhabitable. The second week, training began. Izuku had designed the training program with the same systematic care he applied to everything. It was not a hero training program. It did not begin with physical conditioning or combat application. It began with the armor itself, with learning to inhabit it so completely that the distinction between the conductor's augmentation and her own biological output became, in her perception, seamless. This was not about dependency but about fluency. He wanted her to know the armor the way she knew her own hands. They worked in the courtyard every morning for 2 hours when the weather permitted and in the expanded eastern workshop when it did not. Izuku watched and measured and made calibration adjustments to the conductor layer based on the real-world usage data he was collecting, and the adjustments were incremental and consistent, each one bringing the system's performance closer to the precision he had designed for. Ray learned quickly. This was not a surprise to Izuku, who had assessed her learning pattern from the first visit's technical conversation. But the speed of her adaptation to the augmented output was striking even by his projected curves. She had spent 11 years in meditation-adjacent practice developing a quality of internal awareness that translated directly into precise control of the armor's interface. What she was learning, essentially, was to be very good at something she had always been told to be careful about. The ice formations in the courtyard grew more intricate as her control refined. She began, in the 3rd week, to treat the courtyard as a compositional space, building structures that were functional and beautiful simultaneously, ice that served a demonstrable structural purpose and which was also, undeniably, something that a person had made because they were interested in making it. Rika from the greenhouse came to the courtyard one morning and stood watching for 20 minutes. Then he said, to Ray, could you make a trellis structure? For climbing plants. She looked at him. An ice trellis would melt in spring. I know. But I could take a cast of it while it's standing and make a permanent one from the cast. If you don't mind. Ray looked at the courtyard and then at Rika. What kind of climbing plant, she said. He told her. She made the trellis structure that afternoon, working from the specifications he gave her, and the compound's first permanent garden structure was cast from the form of ice she had built, and it stood against the eastern residential block's courtyard wall from spring through the following winter. This was, Inko noted privately, how community happened. Not through planned integration but through the accumulation of small shared projects that turned strangers into people who had made something together. Mimuri, who had started her educational leave from UA in January and was spending 3 days per week at the compound, watched Ray's training in the courtyard from the library window one morning and came to find Izuku afterward. Her precision is better than anything I've seen from a quirk of this class at her career stage, she said. Her career stage was 11 years of practicing precision internally rather than externally, Izuku said. She's been training this whole time. The direction just changed. Mimuri thought about this. My own training is going to need a different kind of facility, she said. For range testing. The courtyard is too small. I know. I've been designing an expansion. Phase 4 of the compound's growth. He showed her the blueprints on the workbench. She looked at them. The planned expansion added a training facility to the compound's southern boundary, an enclosed structure with the specific dimensional requirements that precision range testing for a pheromone distribution quirk needed. It had clearly been in the plans for some time. You designed this before I agreed to come, she said. I designed it based on the assumption that you would come eventually, he said. I try to build for the outcomes I'm working toward rather than for the outcomes I've currently achieved. She looked at the blueprints for another moment. When does construction begin? She said. Spring, he said. We needed to get through winter with the current structure before expanding. She nodded. She rolled up the blueprints and handed them back to him. Show me the communication network architecture again, she said. I've been thinking about the monitoring gap and I have some observations. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the workshop, and outside the window the winter compound was cold, unlit and alive with the quiet operations of people who were building something seriously, and the armor in the fitting room waited with the particular patience of things that have been made well for a purpose that is approaching. Chapter 21, The Thing That Was Made. Spring arrived at the compound with the particular thoroughness that winters held in check. The snow melted and what it revealed was the compound at its current scale, the workshops and the residential blocks and the greenhouse that had expanded twice since its first iteration, the library, the courtyard with the beginning of the garden that Rika and Ray had been planning together through the cold months, the power generation structures along the northern boundary. 41 people now. Several families had formed within the compound's community, which was something Inko had anticipated and for which she had prepared by organizing a communal childcare structure that she had managed herself until Suda's partner, a former teacher named Hannah, had volunteered to take over the coordination. The compound had, over its 4 years of existence, become something that was difficult to categorize in the available categories. It was not a commune in the political sense because there was no ideology being enforced. It was not a corporation in the commercial sense because its purpose was not profit extraction. It was not a hero agency because it had no commission affiliation and no registered heroes. It was not an academic institution because it had no formal educational mandate. It was, as best Izuku could describe it when people asked, a community organized around independent technical capability. People lived here because the work was meaningful and the community was functional and the power they could not generate elsewhere, political, technical, or otherwise, was generatable here. This was not a satisfying description to people outside it. He had given up trying to make it satisfying. Namiri completed her educational leave in July and filed for a 1-year research sabbatical, which UA's academic board approved without significant difficulty because she had published 3 papers during the leave period that were significant enough to make the sabbatical extension easy to justify. The papers were under a pseudonym. They described, in the abstract language of academic engineering, 3 aspects of the conductor's design methodology, with the specific applications omitted. They had attracted attention in the engineering community that had no idea where they had come from. She moved her primary residence to the compound in August. The day she arrived with the boxes from her apartment, Inko organized a small dinner. Not a ceremony, just dinner, the kind the compound had regularly, with everyone who happened to be free that evening and enough food that no one had to ration. Namiri sat at the table and watched the dinner happen around her with the eyes of someone who had spent 12 years in institutions and was recalibrating to a different kind of structure. And Inko watched Namiri watch and understood what she was seeing and passed her more food and said nothing in particular. In the evening Izuku showed Namiri the expanded training facility that had been completed in June. It was exactly as the blueprints had described, which was more than most things were when built, and the range testing she had been unable to do properly in the courtyard became possible in the new space. She tested her full range with the armor for the first time in the new facility the following morning. The facility's full length was 112 meters. She filled it from one end to the other with a directed pheromone channel that hit the far wall sensors without touching any of the lateral sensors, which were positioned at 1 meter intervals down both sides of the space. Izuku read the sensor data. He did not say anything for a moment. The directional precision, he said, is better than the theoretical projection. I've been practicing the gesture calibration for 3 months, she said. The projection didn't account for the improvement rate under sustained training. He looked at the data again. I'll need to recalibrate the ceiling estimates. He made a note. The armor was built to good tolerances. The upper boundary might be significantly higher than what I designed for. She looked at him. There was something in his expression that she had been learning to read over the months, a particular quality of satisfaction that was not self-congratulation but the specific pleasure of a system working correctly. It was the expression, she had concluded, of someone for whom the work was genuinely the point. Then we'll find out where it is, she said. She ran the test again at full extension. The compound grew. The training continued. The armor waited in the fitting room on its frames, white and green and black, 3 sets of capability that the Commission's assessment framework had never correctly measured and which were now, quietly, becoming something larger than they had been. Outside the compound walls, the hero system continued its operations. All Might had retired 2 years ago, his diminishment finally public, the symbol of peace passing out of active duty in a ceremony that had been enormous and solemn and had left a structural question about the system hanging in the air that no one was quite answering directly. Izuku had watched the retirement broadcast in the compound's common room, surrounded by the community he had built, and had felt the question that All Might's retirement made visible settle into the already existing shape of what the compound was an answer to. Not the only answer. Not a replacement. An alternative, properly demonstrated, that asked the question of what hero society was for in terms that the Commission could not comfortably dismiss. The demonstration was coming. 18 months had become 12 had become 8. The timeline was closing. The armor was trained for. The community was real and functional and growing. Izuku sat in his workshop that night after everyone had gone to sleep and worked on the last subsystem of the network architecture, the piece that would connect the 3 armors into a fully coordinated operational unit, and the compound hummed around him with the life of 41 people who had decided, each in their own way, that what was being built here was worth building. He worked until the early hours. He wrote in his notebook when the work required thinking rather than building. The notebook was number 112. Outside, in the spring city, the hero system kept its vigil, indifferent and enormous and very certain of what it was. It did not yet know about the compound. Not fully. Not in the way that would require it to reckon with the question the compound represented. That was still coming. It was coming soon. The Tech God of Mitsuki. A serialized fanfiction. Act 3. The Weight of What Was Built. Act 3. The Weight of What Was Built. Chapter 22. The City Learns to See. The compound crossed 50 residents in the autumn of Izuku's 23rd year, and the crossing of that number produced something qualitative rather than merely quantitative. 50 people in a shared space with shared infrastructure and shared purpose was not 10 people times 5. It was a different kind of thing. It had weight and momentum. It generated its own internal culture with the natural efficiency of communities that have been functioning long enough to stop performing their values and start simply having them. The culture of the compound, as best anyone inside it could describe it, was built on 3 premises that had never been formally articulated but which everyone knew. First, the work was the point. Not the recognition of the work, not the external validation of the work itself and its quality and its honesty. Second, people were what they were, not what the outside world had decided they were. This applied to the engineers who had been told they were not credentialed enough, to the residents who had come with histories that institutions had filed under categories that did not fit, to Rei who had been told to be smaller for 11 years, to Namuri who had been 2 people for 12, to Inko who had been told her entire adult life that what she could do was not much. Third, if something was broken, you fixed it, and if you could not fix it you described it accurately so someone else could. This applied to machinery and to people and to institutional structures, and the compound had a notably low tolerance for the particular avoidance behavior that involved knowing something was broken and choosing not to say so. Izuku had not designed these premises. He had built a space in which they were natural consequences of the material conditions, and then people had moved in and the premises had emerged from the population. This was the difference between designing a community and cultivating one, and Inko could have explained it but did not need to because the result was visible in every direction. The city of Mitsuki had begun, by autumn, to notice the compound in the way cities notice things that have been present long enough to become features of the landscape. The compound was not invisible, had never been invisible, had simply been below the threshold of the city's active attention. Now, with 50 residents and the expansion of the Phase 4 training facility visible from the adjacent streets and the quiet reputation of Midori Technical in certain engineering communities, it was becoming a landmark. People came to the gate with requests. Not many, at first. A few engineers who had heard, through the professional grapevine, that Midori Technical was doing work of significant interest. A young woman who had been referred by someone in Inko's former community support network, looking for resources for a family member with a difficult-to-manage quirk. 2 academics from Nabu University who were researching independent technical organizations and who wanted to interview someone. Izuku handled the engineers. Inko handled the young woman, and then continued handling it for 3 weeks, and then quietly arranged a consultation with the compound's medical advisor that resulted in outcomes that the official hero support system had not produced in 2 years of trying. The academics were given a tour of the non-restricted portions of the facility and a very accurate account of what Midori Technical was and was not. The academic paper that resulted from this visit described the compound as a novel organizational model for independent technical capability outside the hero industry framework and was published in a journal that nobody outside engineering circles read. Inside engineering circles it was read with interest and occasionally with the specific quality of interest that meant people were thinking about what it would mean to be there. 2 of them wrote letters. Izuku put the letters in a file and thought about Phase 5, which he had been designing for 8 months and which required the kind of growth that was not just quantitative but structural. The compound was approaching the scale at which its current administrative architecture would become insufficient. Inko had been managing community function with assistants she had trained herself, but the model needed to formalize. The workshop complex needed a defined division of research and production that the current open model did not provide. The training facility was running at capacity for 3 armor users and would need to be redesigned if additional people were to be trained. Phase 5 was, in his notebooks, labeled the transition. The compound was becoming a city in function if not in name. The transition had to be managed or it would happen badly on its own, which was what transitions did when they were not managed. He called a planning meeting in November, just the core 4, himself and Inko and Rei and Namuri, in the library after dinner when the compound had settled. He laid out Phase 5 on the library table. He had learned, over the years of running meetings in this compound, to put things on the table in a physical form whenever possible because it changed the quality of the conversation. People engaged differently with something they could point at. He had prepared a set of documents, the structural proposal, the financial analysis, the timeline, and a separate document that was harder to categorize, which described what the compound needed to be in 3 years if the public demonstration was going to happen on the terms he had designed for. Inko read the community structure proposal first, because that was the section she would have the most to say about, and she read it with the focused speed she brought to documents that overlapped with her expertise. She flagged 2 things with a pen and set it down and looked at him. The administrative formalization is overdue, she said. But the structure you've proposed is still too flat for 50+ people. You need a second tier. Not hierarchy for its own sake, but a tier that handles day-to-day operational decisions so that the core decision-making is not bottlenecked. I agree, he said. I left that tier as a placeholder because the right people to fill it have to come from inside the compound. I know who they are, she said. I've been watching for 2 years. He nodded. He had expected this. I'll defer to your assessment on personnel. Namuri had moved to the financial analysis, which she was reading with the specific attention she gave to documents that had strategic implications. She looked up. The capital projection for Phase 5 is larger than the current conductor revenue stream can sustain. Yes. Phase 5 requires external capital. Which means the compound needs to have something worth investing in that does not require investors to know about the armor program. And does it? Namuri said. The power generation system, Izuku said. We have been running independent from the city grid for 3 years. The efficiency metrics on our generation system are significantly better than anything commercially available. I have been holding those metrics back from the patent filing because I wanted the compound's physical infrastructure to be mature before we attracted the kind of investment interest that a patent filing of this nature would generate. Midoriya absorbed this. You've been sitting on an energy technology patent for 3 years. Yes. She set down the financial analysis and looked at him with an expression that was not quite exasperated and not quite amused and was entirely Midoriya. You are consistently more prepared than you appear, she said. I try to appear less prepared than I am, he said. Appearing very prepared makes people nervous. Ray had not said anything yet. She was reading the last document, the one about the public demonstration, which was the hardest to categorize. She read it slowly, which was not her normal speed, which meant she was processing something about it that required the extra time. She set it down and looked at the table for a moment. The demonstration, she said. You describe it as an event that makes ignoring the compound more costly than engaging with it. Can you be specific about what that means? He had been waiting for this question. He looked at Ray with the full attention he always gave to things that mattered. It means an incident, not engineered, but responded to, where the armor's capabilities are deployed publicly and visibly in a context that benefits people who the hero system was not helping. It needs to be significant enough that the Commission's official response becomes a public question rather than a private one. You want to create a situation where the Commission has to account for us, Ray said. I want to create a situation where the Commission's choice between acknowledging us and dismissing us has a public cost attached to the dismissal option, he said. That's different from confrontation. It's legibility. Right now we don't appear in any category they are required to see clearly. I want to appear in a category they cannot see around. Ray was quiet for another moment. Then she said, You're not asking us to be heroes. No, he said. I'm asking you to be what you are, in public, where it matters. The library was very still. Outside, the compound's nighttime sounds were the familiar ones, the distant hum of the power generation system, a lamp in the workshop, the specific quiet of a community of people who had gone to sleep because tomorrow they were going to work again. Inko folded her hands on the table. Phase 5, she said. When do we start? In the spring, Izuku said. When the patent filing is ready. He gathered the documents back into their folder. He thanked them, which he did not always do because he forgot that appreciation required expression and not just the internal experience of it. He went to the workshop and worked for another 2 hours, and the compound breathed around him in the dark. Chapter 23, The Patent and the Ripple. The patent filing went in on the 1st of March. It was filed under Midoriya Technical Systems for a class of distributed thermal exchange energy generation technology that the patent examiner, who had been doing this work for 22 years and had reviewed 12,000 filings, read 3 times before flagging it as requiring specialist review. The specialist review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, 2 things happened. The first was that the energy technology research community, which had not been told about the filing but which had the capacity to notice filings in its category, began to take notice. Academic alerts pinged in 12 universities. 3 industry research directors began making calls. 1 journalist who covered the energy technology sector and who had good instincts started following a lead. The second thing was that the Commission, whose monitoring systems included a filter for significant technical filings by entities in its peripheral awareness category, sent Midoriya Technical Systems a courtesy notification that the filing had been observed and that if Midoriya Technical had any questions about the relationship between its research operations and the Commission's regulatory framework, a consultation could be arranged. Izuku read the courtesy notification with Midoriya, because she was the most informed about Commission communication patterns. This is not casual, she said. They are signaling that they've upgraded their attention level. I know. The filing was the intended trigger. He set the notification down. What does the consultation offer mean? It means they want to understand what you are before they decide what category you belong in. It's an information gathering move. Can they compel a consultation? Not for a private registered research organization. The offer is voluntary. Declining it sends a message. Accepting it sends a different message. What message does accepting send? That you're willing to engage on their terms, which they will interpret as alignment with their framework. That you see yourself as within their system. And declining. That you don't. Which will increase their scrutiny level. Izuku looked at the notification again. There's a third option, he said. Respond with a counter-proposal. We offer to present a summary of our research activities to a commission technical review panel, on our terms, at a time of our choosing. Namiri thought about this. That requires you to have something worth presenting that does not compromise the armor program. The energy technology. The conductor design in its commercial application, without the armor integration layer. The compounds community model, which the academic paper has already made partially public. He paused. We show them enough to be credible and interesting. We don't show them what they would try to control if they knew it existed. Namiri was quiet for a moment, running the implications. You have been thinking about this for longer than this conversation, she said. For about 2 years, he said. She looked at him. He was 23 years old and he had been planning his first formal interaction with the commission for 2 years, and he had filed a patent designed to trigger increased attention, and now he was describing the response to that attention with the specificity of someone who had gamed out the decision tree and arrived at this branch as the preferred one. All right, she said. I'll draft the counter-proposal. I know the commission's communication register better than you do. That's why I'm asking you to, he said. She wrote the counter-proposal that afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs, a professional acknowledgement of the commission's notification, a description of Midori Technical's willingness to engage in technical dialogue, and a proposal for a compound-hosted review session at a date 6 months out, with a specified agenda that covered the patent technology and the compound's organizational model. She showed it to Izuku. He read it once. It's exactly right, he said. I know, she said. They sent it. The commission's response arrived 9 days later. They accepted the counter-proposal. They proposed a review panel of 3, with 2 weeks' notice of the panel members' identities. The date 6 months out was confirmed. Namiri read the acceptance and felt something she had not felt in a long time in relation to the commission, not the familiar undercurrent of managed frustration, but something closer to professional interest. She was going to be on the same side of a commission engagement as someone whose intelligence she respected, and she was going to be bringing information rather than gathering it, and the commission did not know what it had accepted an invitation to see. She put the acceptance in the compound's growing correspondence file and went to find Ray, who was in the courtyard doing the precision training that had become her morning practice, building ice structures with the focused attention of someone who had discovered late in life that the thing they were naturally best at was something they had spent years believing was dangerous. Ray was growing a lattice formation from the courtyard's eastern wall. It extended 3 meters from the surface and held structural complexity that no compression testing had been able to explain by conventional ice physics, which was one of the more interesting data points that the armor's sensor suite had been generating and which Izuku was studying carefully. Namiri stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched. Ray did not stop or acknowledge her presence, which was not rudeness but the particular quality of concentration that the training had developed, the ability to know what was in the space around her without breaking the generation focus. After 4 minutes the lattice was complete. Ray stepped back and looked at it and then looked at Namiri. The commission accepted, Namiri said. Ray looked at the lattice for a moment. How long do we have? 6 months. Enough time, Ray said. For what? Namiri said, though she suspected she knew. To be completely ready, Ray said. She turned back to the lattice and studied it with a critical eye, found a point of imprecision near the upper right quadrant, and corrected it with a gesture so small and certain that Namiri almost missed it. The lattice was now, in Namiri's assessment, perfect. Yes, she agreed. Enough time. Chapter 24, What Inko Carries. The green armor had a different relationship with Inko than the other 2 armors had with their users, and this was something Izuku had understood in the design phase and built for, and which he did not discuss openly because the nature of it was not something that invited public discussion. Ray had come to the armor from a place of suppression. The armor was release. Namiri had come to it from a place of double performance, the professional self and the private self running simultaneously. The armor collapsed that doubling into a single channel. Both of these relationships were about capacity, about the armor enabling something that had been present but constrained. Inko's relationship was different. Inko had not been suppressed in the same way. She had been assessed incorrectly, which was different. The system had looked at her telekinetic quirk and measured its natural output and concluded that the measurement was the person, that what she could do in an unaugmented state was what she was. The armor did not release something she had been holding back. It revealed something that had never been correctly seen. The difference was subtle, but Izuku had felt it in the design and had built for it. Rei's armor was calibrated for precision from a large natural output. Namiri's was calibrated for directional control from a distribution-type quirk. Inko's was calibrated for revelation, for the progressive uncovering of a ceiling that had been assumed to be far lower than it was. What this meant practically was that Inko's training had a different arc. It was not about learning to direct something she had always been able to generate. It was about gradually encountering the extent of what she could do and integrating that encounter without losing the groundedness that was her most fundamental characteristic. This was, of the 3 training programs, the most delicate. Izuku had been managing it carefully for 8 months, moving the conductor's amplification ceiling upward in increments that were small enough to be integrated before the next increment arrived. He did not rush it. He had learned, in his 4 years of building things with people rather than in spite of them, that there was a pace at which revelation could be received and a pace at which it became destabilizing, and the difference between them was a design consideration. In spring, 6 months before the commission review, he raised the ceiling to 70% of the theoretical maximum. The training session that day was in the outdoor area behind the Phase 4 facility, a large cleared space that the compound used for extended range work. Inko came out in the green armor with the particular quality of presence she had developed over 8 months of training, which was different from her community administrator presence in a way that was not a split but a deepening. She was fully herself in both modes, only in the armor the self had more room. Izuku explained the adjustment. He was precise about what 70% meant in terms of the sensor data and what it did not mean in terms of any obligation on her part to reach it. She listened and nodded, and he stood at the edge of the space and watched. She began at the range she was comfortable with, extending her reach across the cleared space with the controlled ease of someone who had been practicing this for months. Then she extended further. The conductor layer, sensing the extension, matched it with amplification, the biological signal and the electromagnetic scaffold climbing together. At 60% she paused. He could see her integrating. She stood still for about 90 seconds, which he had learned to read as her internal calibration process, the particular stillness she went into when she was mapping new capability onto her existing sense of herself. Then she went to 65. Then 70. At 70% of the theoretical maximum, Inko Midoriya's telekinetic range extended approximately 1.5 kilometers in all directions from her position. The payload at that range was sufficient to move objects of several tons. The precision of control at any point within the range was, per the sensor data, exact. She stood in the middle of the cleared space and was very still. Izuku waited. He had learned when to wait. After a while she turned and looked at him across the space. Even at this distance he could see her expression clearly. It was not triumph or relief or even the particular quality of satisfaction that Rei had after the courtyard full output test. It was something more patient than those things. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a very long time for the world to catch up to something she had quietly suspected about herself, and the world had now arrived. The things I could have done, she said. He walked across the space to where she was standing. He did not have an answer to that sentence because there was no answer, only the acknowledgement that it was true. The things you will do, he said instead. She looked at him for a long moment. The green armor caught the morning light and her eyes in the armor's framing were the same green his notebooks had always been, which was not a coincidence in the design and which he had never told her. You made the armor green, she said. Yes, he said. Because of the notebooks. He had told her once, many years ago, that the notebooks were green because she had bought the first one when he was 4 years old. She had bought it at the shop near the clinic, on the drive back from the quirk registry, and it had been green because it was the one on the end of the shelf and she had grabbed the first one she could reach because she was trying not to cry while also doing something useful for the child sitting in the back seat who had just been told something terrible and who was already looking at his hands with an expression that was not sadness but inquiry. Yes, he said. She put her hand on his face, as she had when he was 4, as she had when he was 18 and the offer was accepted, as she did at the moments that mattered. The gauntlet was smooth against his cheek, the conductor layer's ambient hum faint but present. "All right," she said. She dropped her hand. She turned back to the cleared space. "Let's work." They worked for 2 more hours. The morning was bright and cold and specific in the way of mornings that are being experienced fully, and the compound around them continued its operations, and Inko's range extended into the city beyond the walls and touched things she could not see and knew exactly where they were. Chapter 25, The night the city broke open. The incident that changed the compound's relationship to the city did not arrive on a schedule. This was, Izuku reflected afterward, entirely how he should have expected it to arrive, because the incidents that mattered almost never came when you had prepared for them, only when you had prepared yourself. It came on a Wednesday evening in late July, 3 months before the scheduled commission review, in the form of a notification from the compound's external sensor network, which Izuku had installed 18 months ago along the outer boundary and which monitored the adjacent streets for structural anomalies and seismic events as a precautionary infrastructure measure. The notification was seismic. A significant one. He was in the workshop when it came through. He looked at the sensor data and identified immediately that the source was not a natural seismic event but a localized structural collapse, the specific signature of a building foundation failing rather than the ground itself moving. The location was approximately 900 meters north of the compound wall, in the older residential district that bordered the industrial zone. He sent a compound internal alert and went to the fitting room. He did not have armor. The armor was for people with quirks to amplify. What he had was the suit he had built for himself over the past year, which he had never discussed with the others because it was not the same category of thing and required a different kind of explanation. It was not an armor in the sense of the 3 others. It was an engineering platform, structural reinforcement, sensory augmentation, tool integration, the conductor layer running not on biological quirk output but on a sophisticated environmental sensing system that functioned as a technological equivalent of the perception it was designed to support. It was what a quirkless person could wear when the quirkless person had spent 8 years designing support technology and knew exactly what the human body needed to do things that bodies without quirks could not do. He was suited in 6 minutes. This was not fast enough. He found the other 3 in the corridor, Inko already in the green armor, Namiri in the black, and Rei, who had been in the training facility when the alert came through and who was wearing the white and silver with the particular quality of readiness she brought to everything she did now, which was not urgency but presence. There was not a long conversation. He showed them the sensor data on his wrist display. They looked. Rei looked for 3 seconds. Namiri looked for 4. Inko looked for 2 and then looked at him. "Multi-story collapse," she said. "Residential. Approximately 6 stories, based on the seismic signature. Pre-code building, which means the foundation failure is consistent with a known failure mode for that construction era. People inside," Rei said. "Wednesday evening. Occupancy would be high." Namiri was already running the external communication on her armor system. "Hero dispatch is aware. ETA for the nearest available team is 14 minutes. The rescue specialization team is 22 minutes out, there's an active operation in Kamino." 14 minutes was a long time inside a collapsed building. They went through the compound gate at pace. The scene at the building was what the sensor data had suggested and worse in the particular way that data always understated physical reality. The structure had not fully collapsed but had undergone a partial pancake failure in the northern stairwell section, which had taken 3 floors with it and had left the remaining 4 in a state of structural uncertainty that the dust cloud and the settling sounds and the crack propagation that Izuku could track on his suit's structural sensors all indicated was not stable. There were people in the rubble. He could hear them. His suit's auditory augmentation had found 17 distinct sound sources consistent with survivors in the debris field before they had crossed the perimeter. He shared the data with the others through the armor network. What happened next was not a planned operation. It was the product of months of training in the specific application of each armor's capabilities to real conditions, and the product of living and working together long enough to have a shared language that did not require spoken sentences, and the product of 3 people who had spent years being told that what they were was not enough, discovering that what they were was considerably more than that. Ray went first. The structural assessment that Izuku's sensors provided identified 4 points in the debris field where the load was concentrating in ways that indicated secondary collapse risk. Ray generated ice columns at each of those 4 points simultaneously, with a precision that was not the compressed force of ice as a weapon but the precise engineering application of ice as a temporary structural support, filling the load-bearing gaps that the pancake failure had created and stabilizing the remaining structure against further collapse. The building's remaining upper floor settled and held. Then Inko moved. The rubble field was dense and irregular and full of voids, some of which held survivors and some of which were structural and could not be disturbed without triggering secondary collapse. Inko's telekinetic reach mapped the field the way a hand reads Braille, feeling the weight and resistance of every element in the debris, identifying the voids, identifying the people, identifying which elements could be moved and in what sequence without destabilizing what remained stable. She began to move things. Not quickly. Precisely. The conductor layer was running at 80%, which was higher than any training session, and she held it without strain because she had been building to this for 8 months and the ceiling was not where she had started from. Chunks of masonry the size of cars lifted and settled in the clear space to the west of the building, their placement deliberate rather than discarded, forming a flat surface that rescue workers could use to stage equipment. Lemuri was in the crowd that had gathered on the safe perimeter, because the crowd was where her capabilities applied. The rescue effort required coordination. People were emerging from the parts of the building that had not collapsed, some of them injured, some of them in shock, some of them looking for family members who were still inside. The emergency services that had arrived ahead of the hero teams were good at their jobs but were also working at the edge of their capacity. Lemuri did not use the pheromone distribution on anyone. She walked through the crowd in the black armor and spoke to people and organized the flow of information and connected the people who needed to be connected, and the armor's presence did something that she had not anticipated. People looked at it and were calm. Not the calm of enforcement, the calm of something that looked competent and purposeful in a situation that had none. Izuku was in the rubble. His suit could not move the debris that Inko moved, and it could not stabilize the structure the way Rei's ice did. What it could do was get into spaces that were too small for rescue workers in standard equipment, because he had designed it for exactly this kind of dimensional constraint, and it could identify survivors in those spaces with the suit's sensor network, and it could communicate their exact location and status through the armor network to Inko, who could then calculate the extraction sequence. He found 11 people in the voids in the first 20 minutes. The hero rescue team arrived at minute 14, as dispatched. They came in 4-person standard formation with the commissioned standard rescue equipment, which was very good equipment, and they stopped when they encountered the scene that had developed in their absence. The building was stable. The rubble field was being systematically cleared by someone in green armor working from sensor data in real time. The structural supports at the critical load points were ice columns of a precision and stability that the rescue team's structural engineer later described as exceeding anything the Commission's own support materials could provide. The crowd was organized. The first 4 survivors had already been extracted and were receiving medical attention from the emergency services. The rescue team lead, a hero whose commission designation was Steadfast and who had been doing structural rescue for 9 years, looked at all of this for approximately 10 seconds. Then she said, into her team channel, "We integrate. North approach, standard formation, follow the green one sequencing." They integrated. The next 42 minutes were the most efficient structural rescue operation that Steadfast had been part of in 9 years, which she also said, later, in the debrief. 23 survivors extracted. 0 secondary collapse events. 3 of the survivors who the standard rescue timeline would not have reached in time were reached in time. The white armor's ice columns were photographed by 6 different people in the crowd before the hero teams completed their perimeter. The green armor was in the background of 42 different images that the evening's news coverage generated. The black armor appeared in 11. Izuku's suit appeared in none, because he had been inside the building the entire time, and this was intentional, and he had not had time to be glad about it until they were walking back to the compound. They walked back in the dark, the 4 of them, the armors catching the street lights, and the city behind them was doing the things cities did after something like this, settling, processing, the news infrastructure already generating the description that would be what people remembered. They'll want to know who we are, Namiri said. Yes, Izuku said. The commission review is in 3 months. Yes, Izuku said. Ray was looking at the city around them, at the buildings and the lights and the people in the lit windows doing the ordinary things of a Wednesday evening. We will not be invisible again, she said. It was not a lament. No, Izuku agreed. We won't. The compound gate came into view. They went through it, and the gate closed behind them, and the compound was exactly as they had left it, warm and working. And the city outside the walls was different from what it had been an hour ago because something had happened in it that had no name yet in the category system the Hero Society used. They would give it a name. Not tonight. Tonight there was after-operation process. The armors needed to be checked, the sensor data needed to be archived, Inko needed to eat something because she had been at 80% for 42 minutes and that required caloric replacement. Ray needed the ice compression in her hands to be monitored because the high sustained output had produced a feedback loop in her left hand that Izuku wanted to examine. The naming could wait. The work was immediate. He took off his suit and went to the workshop and began the post-operation technical review, and the compound breathed around him in the summer night, and the city outside processed what it had seen. Chapter 26, the morning after the world noticed. The news had a field day. 3 armored figures at a building collapse in northern Muzutafu. No commission registration. No hero agency affiliation. No names, no designations, no press statements. They had arrived before the official hero response, they had stabilized the structure, they had extracted more survivors than the standard protocol predicted for that response window, and then they had walked away. The coverage ran the full spectrum from admiring to alarmed, which was the spectrum the hero media always ran when something fell outside its established categories. The admiring coverage focused on the outcomes, 23 survivors, no secondary collapse, a rescue efficiency that hero agency analysts were quietly annotating in their internal reports. The alarmed coverage focused on the process, unregistered operators, unauthorized hero-adjacent activity, a precedent that the Commission would need to address. Steadfast gave a press statement that was careful and accurate. She described the unknown operators as having demonstrated significant technical capability and having integrated productively with the official rescue effort. She did not editorialize. When asked whether she was concerned about unregistered operators, she said that her operational assessment was of the outcomes and that the outcomes had been good. This was quoted extensively. The Commission's official statement came the following afternoon and was drafted, Namiri noted when she read it, by someone who had been dealing with the constraint of needing to neither endorse nor condemn something for which they lacked sufficient information. It acknowledged the incident, noted that the safety and welfare of the building's occupants was the primary concern, expressed appreciation for all parties who had contributed to the rescue effort, and stated that the Commission was gathering information regarding the event. They don't know who we are yet, she said. They will within a week, Izuku said. He was eating breakfast while reading the coverage on his tablet, the particular morning after quality of someone who had been awake for significant portions of the night running technical review and was now in the phase of operations that required food and caffeine. The compound address is registered. The Commission has our filing from the spring. Once their investigators connect the armor technology to the conductor patent and the compound's registered address, the connection is findable. Do we want them to find it or do we want to tell them? Inko said. She was at the table with tea and the particular composure of someone who had been at 80% for 42 minutes the previous evening and had slept well anyway because her relationship with her own capability was no longer something she had to manage around. I want to tell them, Izuku said. Before they find it. On our terms. It moves the framing from discovery to disclosure. The review meeting is in 3 months, Namiri said. Do we move it up? We contact the Commission today and offer to move the review to next month, Izuku said. With a note that in light of the Muzutafu incident, we believe an accelerated timeline serves everyone's interests. Namiri absorbed this. We're being proactive rather than reactive. We're being the kind of entity that the Commission has no established category for, Izuku said. We're not a hero agency requesting approval. We're not a corporation seeking licensing. We're a community with independent capability that demonstrated that capability in a public context and is now offering a structured conversation about what that means. He paused. Categories that the Commission has not pre-assigned are harder for them to handle than categories that map onto existing frameworks. I want to hold that position. Ray had been listening from the window where she had been standing since they sat down to breakfast, looking out at the courtyard where her ice structures from the previous morning's training session were still visible in the early light. She turned. What does the Commission actually want? She said. At its foundation, when everything else is removed. What does it want? It was a better question than the tactical ones, and they all knew it. Izuku set down his tablet. Stability, he said. The Commission wants the hero system to continue functioning without disruption. It wants the public to remain confident in the system's adequacy. It wants to control the definition of what hero-adjacent capability is and who has legitimate access to it. And we are a disruption, Ray said. We are potentially a disruption, Izuku said. Or we are potentially a demonstration that the system's definition of legitimate capability was too narrow. Those are different things. Whether the Commission reads us as the first or the second depends on how we present ourselves. And how do we present ourselves? Inko said. As what we are, Izuku said simply. A community that built independent capability for independent reasons, that demonstrated that capability in a crisis because that is what you do with capability when a crisis arrives. Not as a challenge. Not as an alternative system seeking recognition. As a fact. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the compound was waking up. The sound of the greenhouse being opened came through the window, Rika starting his morning rounds. Somewhere in the residential block a child laughed at something. A fact, Namuri said slowly, testing the weight of the word. We exist, Izuku said. We built what we built. The building's occupants are alive. These are not positions to argue from. They are the condition from which any argument starts. Inko put down her tea. Write the letter, she said. Move the meeting. He wrote the letter that morning. Namuri reviewed it and changed 4 words. He sent it. The Commission responded the same afternoon. The review was moved to the following month. The panel would now include 5 members rather than 3, which Namuri said was an escalation of attention level and which Izuku had anticipated and for which he had already adjusted his preparation materials. The compound had 1 month. Izuku went back to work. Chapter 27, The Month of Preparation. The month before the Commission review was the most concentrated period of preparation the compound had experienced, and the compound had experienced several concentrated periods. Izuku worked on the presentation materials with the same systematic completeness he brought to engineering projects. The material needed to accomplish 3 things: establish the compound's technical credibility with a panel that would include people who knew what they were looking at, describe the community and its organizational model in terms that were accurate without triggering the Commission's categories for unauthorized operational structures, and create a baseline record of what the compound was and what it was not that would be difficult to subsequently misrepresent. The third objective was the one he spent the most time on. He had learned, from Namuri's documentation and from his own 2 years of researching the Commission's institutional behavior patterns, that organizations of the Commission's type had a tendency to encounter new information and file it in the category that was closest to hand, whether or not that category accurately described the new information. He wanted the presentation to preemptively establish categories that were accurate rather than convenient. He worked with Namuri on the Commission-facing strategy. She had insight into how the panel members would receive different kinds of information, which turned out to be very useful because the 5 panel members included at least 2 whose specific institutional positioning she could characterize from her years of adjacent work. Yokoi, she said, looking at the panel composition when it arrived, is a technical specialist. She will engage with the conductor and energy technology data at a serious level. If you lose her early, you lose the room. I know Yokoi's published work, Izuku said. I've been reading it for 4 years. Of course you have, Namuri said. The second one to watch is Nara. He is a Commission institutional veteran and his primary concern is precedent. He will be running a parallel calculation the entire time about what accepting any aspect of what you present would mean for how the Commission handles similar situations in the future. What precedent does he want to avoid? Unregistered capability operating in Commission jurisdiction without Commission oversight. That is his nightmare scenario. Then I need to establish that we are not seeking to operate in Commission jurisdiction in any ongoing sense. The incident response was a one-time deployment in a crisis context, not a model for regular unregistered hero operations. Is that accurate? She said. He was quiet for a moment. For now, he said. In the long term, what we build toward will require a different conversation. But that conversation is not this one. All right, she said. Then that's the position. Inko prepared the community model presentation herself. She had been doing community administration for 5 years at the compound and had the institutional knowledge to describe it accurately and the communication skill to describe it clearly. Her section of the presentation was the most accessible, deliberately, because she understood that the panel members who were not technical specialists needed a way into the compound's reality that did not require technical fluency. She described the compound as a community organized around independent capability development. Not a hero organization. Not a criminal enterprise. A community, with the same mundane attributes that communities had, people who lived there, children who were growing up there, a library and a greenhouse and a shared kitchen and a small administrative apparatus that managed the logistics of shared life. She also described, very briefly and with careful accuracy, who had come to the compound and why. Not names. Not personal histories. The category, people who had found, through various paths, that the existing framework had not accurately assessed what they could do. Who had chosen to be in a place where they were seen accurately. Who were building something because building it was what the situation required. She showed this section to Ray before the meeting. Ray read it carefully. She was sitting at the table by her window, the one with the view of the courtyard, the one that had been put there because someone had noticed she looked at things for a long time. The autumn courtyard was in the early stages of its color change, the climbing plants on Rika's cast trellis going amber at the edges. People who the framework had not accurately assessed, she said. Yes, Inko said. That's accurate, Ray said. That's very accurate. She handed the section back. Keep it. Ray's own contribution to the preparation was training. She spent the month working at higher output levels than she had attempted before, because if there was to be a practical demonstration following the formal presentation, which was Izuku's plan for the second part of the review session, she wanted to be at the peak of what she could do. The practical demonstration was Izuku's own design decision and it was the most audacious element of the whole thing. Most entities seeking commission engagement presented documentation. He was going to present documentation and then take the panel outside and show them what had been built. Not as a threat. Not as a demonstration of force. As a fact, in the concrete sense, here is what exists. Here is what it can do. These are not arguments. These are conditions of the present reality that you are now invited to see clearly. He had told Namuri this plan on the second day of the month. She had sat with it for an unusually long time. The panel will include at least one person who will interpret a practical demonstration as a display of force regardless of your framing, she said. Yes, he said. You're willing to accept that risk. The risk of being misread is present whether or not we demonstrate. The benefit of demonstrating is that the people who are willing to see clearly have something concrete to see. I think the risk-benefit calculation favors demonstrating. She thought about this. And if it goes badly? The compound's current operational profile is legal, he said. The incident response was within a gray area that Commission Council has not yet characterized formally, which means they have no clean mechanism for action against us based on that incident alone. If the review goes badly, we are in a worse political position but not a materially different legal one. He paused. If it goes well, we have a foundation for the next conversation. The next conversation being a formal framework for what the compound is, he said. Something the Commission recognizes without controlling. A category that does not currently exist. Namuri looked at him. You want to create a new category. I want to demonstrate that one is needed, he said. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the quality she brought to decisions she had thought through fully and had arrived at. "All right," she said. "I'll handle Nara during the demonstration. He'll need managing." "I know," Izuku said. "That's why you're presenting beside me." The month passed in work. The compound kept its other operations running because the compound was not holding its breath for the commission. It was a community and communities continued their ordinary operations regardless of what their members were also doing. The greenhouse produced the autumn yield. The shared kitchen fed 50 people. The children who lived in the residential block started the new academic year at the school that had been arranged for them 3 years ago, because Inko had arranged it, because communities have children and children go to school. 2 weeks before the review, the journalist who had been following the energy technology patent since the spring published an article. It described Midori Technical Systems, based on public filings and the Nabu University academic paper, as an independent technical organization of significant capability operating in a space the Commission framework had not yet formally addressed. It quoted the academic paper's description of the compound's organizational model. It did not mention the armor or the incident response directly, but it linked both in a way that a careful reader could follow. The article was read by a significant number of people. Several of them wrote to Midori Technical Systems. Their letters were added to the file that had started the previous autumn. 1 week before the review, Izuku went through the presentation materials one final time, alone, in the workshop, after everyone else had gone to sleep. He was not checking for errors. The errors had been found and corrected. He was reading through it the way you read something you have built to make sure it is what you intended. It was what he had intended. He put it down and looked at the workshop and thought about the workshop on Kamino Avenue where he had walked through a 4-centimeter gap in a door 11 years ago and found a disassembled weight redistribution harness and a man who had looked at a 15-year-old boy's observation about asymmetric load profiles and had asked, simply, to hear the rest. He thought about Notebook 47, the one with the first version of the plan. He thought about the kitchen table on his 18th birthday, the offer accepted, the city outside the window. He thought about 3 letters and 3 responses and 3 armors and a courtyard full of ice and a building that had not collapsed further because it had been held. He thought about 51 people asleep in the residential block who had chosen to be here because here was what he had built and what his mother had built and what Rei and Namiri had chosen, and the choosing mattered as much as the building. He closed the workshop lights and went to his own room and slept, and the compound held its breath in the quiet way of things that do not hold their breath, that simply continue being what they are, which is the only posture available to something real. Chapter 28, The Commission Comes to the Compound. The 5-person panel arrived on a Tuesday in early September. They came in 2 commission vehicles with the understated official designation that commission vehicles always had, the kind of marking that did not shout authority but was legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Izuku met them at the gate himself, which was a decision rather than a convenience, because the person who met you at the gate was the first statement about what kind of place you were entering. He was in the clothes he wore every day, which were functional and well-maintained and not dressed up for the occasion because dressing up for the commission would have been a performance of deference he had not decided to give. He introduced himself by name and offered the first panel member a handshake. She was Yokoi, the technical specialist, and she shook his hand with the directness of a person who assessed quickly and adjusted later. Nara was third out of the second vehicle, compact and professionally neutral in the way that institutional veterans were professionally neutral, carrying in his bearing the specific quality of someone who had seen many presentations and was approaching this one from the position of having an existing framework that he was prepared to fit new information into. Izuku had thought about Nara carefully. He had not found a way to preempt the framework, so he had designed the presentation to be too large for it. He walked them through the compound on the way to the library where the formal session was to be held. The walk was deliberate, the route he had chosen past the greenhouse, the residential block, the children's area where 2 8-year-olds were currently conducting a debate about something with the seriousness that children bring to things that matter to them, the workshop complex with its visible operations through the transparent sections he had built into the facade for exactly this kind of tour. He wanted them to see the compound before they heard about it. Yokoi stopped at the workshop facade and looked through it for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she continued walking. This told Izuku what he had hoped to confirm. She recognized what she was seeing. The library was arranged for the presentation, chairs for the panel on one side, materials on the table, a projection system that the compound's electrical infrastructure ran without the flicker of grid-dependent power. Inko was already there, at the side of the table, with the composure she always had, which was the composure of someone who had nothing to prove because what she was did not require proof. Rei was not in the library. She was in the courtyard, because that was her part of the day's plan. Namiri was seated at the presentation table, in civilian clothes, and she watched the panel file in with the particular quality of attention of someone who knew several of them from adjacent professional contexts and was now on the other side of the table from them for the first time. Nara's expression when he recognized her was very controlled but not completely controlled. She had expected this and had planned her expression in response, which was simply herself, not apologetic, not defiant. Present. Izuku began. He presented the compound's founding, history, and current organizational structure in 20 minutes. He was not trying to be brief for efficiency. He had found, in the preparation, that 20 minutes was the correct length for this content and any shorter would feel dismissive and any longer would feel defensive and the goal was neither. He presented the energy technology patent in technical detail that was aimed at Yokoi's level, which meant that the 3 panel members without technical backgrounds would follow the general argument and Yokoi would follow the specifics and both groups would come away with something. This was a teaching design principle that he had developed from building things that needed to be explained to multiple audiences. Yokoi asked 4 questions. They were exactly the questions he had expected from someone who had read the patent filing carefully, which she clearly had. He answered them in full. He presented the conductor technology in its commercial application, demonstrating a device on the table, explaining its principle, its existing gray market distribution context, and his intentions for formal commercialization through proper licensing channels. He noted that the gray market distribution had occurred in a regulatory gray area and that he had sought clarification of that area as part of the current engagement. This was an acknowledgement of the edge of the rules behavior that had been part of the compound's early history, stated plainly, without framing it as either fully legitimate or as a deliberate violation. It was what it had been. Nara's expression at this section was the most difficult to read but Namiri, who was watching him from the adjacent chair, shifted her weight very slightly in a way that told Izuku the acknowledgement had been received as credible rather than as evasive. Inko presented the community section. She spoke in the register she used for things that mattered, not formal and not casual, the register of someone who is simply telling you something true. She described the compound as a community. She described the people in it. She described the administrative systems she ran and why they worked. She described, with the same plainness, the category of person who had found their way to the compound, people whose capabilities had been assessed narrowly and who had found in this place something the outside framework had not offered them. She did not mention Rei by name. She did not need to. The white armor, which was in the fitting room 2 buildings over, was going to speak for itself in approximately 40 minutes. She described Namiri without naming the commission context, a professional who had spent years working in a dual register and who had found in the compound a single register in which both her professional capability and her personal values were coherent. Namiri, beside her, sat with this description with a stillness that was not discomfort but its absence. Nara said something at this point. He said, "You are describing a collection of individuals who have chosen to operate outside the registered hero framework." It was framed as a statement but had the structure of a challenge. Inko looked at him with the expression she wore when someone had said something that contained an accurate observation and an inaccurate implication and the two needed to be separated. "I'm describing a community," she said. The question of whether the registered hero framework is the only legitimate framework for technical capability is one that I would suggest this meeting is, in part, about. The library was quiet for a moment. Yokoi made a note. Namiri presented the incident response section, because she was the correct person to present it, someone who had been in a hero-adjacent professional context for 12 years, who had seen and participated in commission-sanctioned rescue operations, and who could therefore describe what had happened in the building collapse with a specific comparative frame that made its qualities legible. She described the timeline. She described the structural stabilization. She described the extraction sequencing. She described her own role in crowd management. She described the integration with Steadfast's team and Steadfast's operational assessment. Then she placed on the table the sensor data from Izuku's suit, the full record of the operation, time-stamped and annotated, the kind of documentation that commission rescue teams generated for their own operations and which was considered the standard of operational accountability. "This is the operational record," she said. "It is complete. The panel is welcome to take it." Nara's expression changed in a way that was not quite surprise but was the adjacent state, the state of someone whose framework has encountered a piece of information that does not map onto it. The operational record was exactly the kind of accountability documentation the Commission required of its own operations. It was complete. It was professionally formatted. It documented an incident response that by any outcome metric the Commission used was successful. And it was being provided voluntarily, by people who had no Commission obligation to produce it. Izuku had known that the operational record would be the most difficult thing in the presentation for the Commission's institutional framework to categorize. You could not fit this into the unauthorized operations category without simultaneously acknowledging that the authorization framework had failed to produce an equivalent response in the time window available. And you could not fit it into the authorized operations category without creating a precedent that Nara would find alarming. What you could do, which was what he hoped the panel would do, was sit with the fact that it did not fit either category and allow that sitting with to generate the question he wanted them to ask. He said, "We would like to show you something, if the panel is willing to move outside." Chapter 29, The Demonstration. The courtyard had been prepared. Not decorated. Not staged. Cleared, which was different. The container planters moved to the edges, the pathways clear, the space open in a way that was functional rather than theatrical. The autumn light was the color of things that had been held long enough to become their final form, and the compound was exactly what it was, which was the point. Ray was standing at the far end of the courtyard in the white and silver armor. The panel members came through the library's courtyard door and arranged themselves at the near end of the space. Izuku stood to the side where he could see both the panel and Ray and the space between them. He said, "The armor you will see operates through an integrated conductor layer that interfaces with the user's quirk at the biological frequency level. It does not replace what the user can naturally do. It stabilizes and extends it. What you are about to see is what one person with an ice quirk, working with correctly designed technology, is capable of." He nodded to Ray. She began at low output, which was itself significant. The ice that emerged from her at low conductor amplification was more precise and more intricate than anything the Commission's standard quirk assessments for ice-type users would have predicted, because the Commission's assessments were done on unaugmented natural output and did not account for what correctly applied technology could do. The ice formed a structure at the center of the courtyard that was not a weapon and was not a wall. It was architectural. It was the kind of thing that required both high quirk output and structural design intelligence, and the combination was not something the Commission's category system for ice-type quirks had a slot for. Yokoi was watching with an expression that was doing significant work. Ray raised the conductor amplification. The structure grew. The courtyard walls on all four sides began to acquire a surface of ice that was not frost but formation, deliberate and complex, each element connected to the central structure in a load-bearing relationship that was, Izuku knew from his sensor data, actually load-bearing in the engineering sense. The ice formations were supporting the weight of the additional surface ice, redistributing load through the crystalline matrix exactly as a designed structure would. Ray had been working on this particular generation since early spring. It was not a display. It was the thing she had been learning to do with her quirk and the armor together, the full expression of what 8 months of developing control had built toward. She went to full amplification. The courtyard filled. The formations extended upward past the compound's wall height, which was approximately 5 meters, and continued, columns of ice that caught the September light and distributed it through their crystalline structure in a way that the physics of ice did not typically produce, because the structure was not natural ice but quirk-generated ice with conductor refined crystalline geometry, and the geometry was doing things with light that Izuku had been studying carefully and that Yokoi, he could see from her face, was also very interested in. The Commission panel stood at the near end of the courtyard and were surrounded, on 3 sides, by a structure that had been made by one person in approximately 8 minutes. Nara had gone very still. Izuku said, into the quiet, for the last 11 years, the person generating this has been in a psychiatric facility practicing the suppression of this capability. What you are looking at is what was always there. He had debated including that sentence. He had decided, in the end, that the demonstration required context that was honest and that the commission needed to hear the cost of the system it ran in the most concrete possible terms. No one said anything. Ray withdrew the generation gradually, the structures diminishing inward in the reverse of the order they had appeared. The courtyard returned to itself, and the autumn light was plain again, and Ray was standing at the far end in the white and silver armor that she had been wearing for 8 months and which had in that time become, unmistakably, hers. Yokoi said, is the structural precision a function of the conductor layer or of the user's natural control? It was exactly the right question. Both, Izuku said. The conductor provides frequency stabilization that eliminates output variation under emotional or physical stress. The control is the user's. The conductor makes the control consistent. What you saw was what she is, running on a stable platform. Yokoi looked at Ray. Then she looked at Izuku. This technology does not currently exist in the Commission's approved support item database, she said. No, Izuku said. It predates the approved database. The conductor was developed here before any Commission engagement. Nara spoke. The regulatory path for technology of this kind, he said, would normally proceed through Commission certification before deployment in any context involving registered quirk users. Izuku looked at him. The regulatory path you are describing was designed for the support item ecosystem as it currently exists, he said. I would be glad to discuss what a certification process for technology of this kind should look like. That is one of the conversations I was hoping this review would make possible. Nara held this for a moment. He was, Izuku could see, doing the calculation that Namuri had predicted, the precedent calculation, the framework calculation, the mapping new information onto existing categories calculation. But the categories were not large enough, and Nara was not someone who would pretend they were when the evidence in front of him made that pretense unavailable. That would need to be a formal process, Nara said. I agree, Izuku said. I'm suggesting we begin one. The panel talked among themselves for a while, at the end of the courtyard, while Izuku stood with Inko and Namuri and Ray had joined them, the armor still on because she did not need to remove it and because its presence in the group was a fact of its own. Inko stood beside Ray and did not say anything because nothing needed to be said. Namuri stood on the other side of Izuku and was watching the panel with the professional attention she had been bringing to the Commission's behavior for 12 years, reading the posture and the micro-expressions and the decision dynamics of a group of people encountering something their framework was not large enough to contain. Yokoi is already sold, Namuri said quietly. She's been sold since the workshop facade. Nara, Izuku said. Nara is doing the calculation, she said. He will arrive somewhere. Where, Ray said, which was the question in the smallest number of words. I think he will arrive at the conclusion that establishing a formal process is less costly than not establishing one, Namuri said. The incident response has already happened. The public coverage has already happened. The question now is whether the Commission manages the relationship with what exists or allows the relationship to remain unmanaged, and Nara is someone who values management over its absence even when management means acknowledging something uncomfortable. The panel finished their internal discussion. They came back. Yokoi was the one who spoke. We would like to establish a formal technical review process for the conductor technology and the associated armor applications, she said. This is not a certification. It is the beginning of a process that could lead to certification. The distinction is important. The distinction is very important and I agree with it, Izuku said. Nara said, the Commission will need an ongoing point of contact for any future operational deployments of the armor technology in public contexts. This was a requirement for oversight, stated as a condition. Izuku had expected it. Namuri Kayama, he said. She has the professional background to interface with Commission processes and has the compound's full trust. She has been here for over a year. Nara looked at Namuri. She looked back at him with the expression of a person who has been on two sides of a table and has chosen which side she is on. I'm familiar with how the commission works, she said. That's useful in this context. Nara, after a moment, nodded. Not warmly. Professionally. Which was exactly what it needed to be. The panel prepared to leave. Izuku walked them out. Yokoi fell back to walk beside him at the gate and said, quietly, so only he could hear, the conductor design. I have been working on an adjacent problem for 4 years. I would like to see your derivations. I'll send them, he said. She nodded and got into the vehicle. The vehicles left. The gate closed. The compound was the same as it had been 2 hours ago and different in a way that did not have a clean physical location. He stood at the gate for a moment. Behind him, the compound's afternoon operations were resuming, the natural return of 51 people to the work that was always there. Inko appeared beside him. She had changed from her presentation clothes back to what she wore every day, which had happened at some point between the panel's departure and this moment and which was itself a statement about what the commission's visit was and was not in the scope of what the compound was. Well, she said. Well, he said. It's a beginning, she said. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it is. She put her arm through his and they walked back into the compound together, and the gate was behind them and the work was ahead, and the autumn was doing the thing autumn does, being brilliant and temporary and entirely itself, and the compound was alive around them with the people who had chosen to be in it. Chapter 30, What Gets Built After the Foundation. In the weeks after the commission review, the compound made no announcements. This was a decision. The news had the building collapse photographs and the coverage and the speculation, and the announcement that Midori Technical Systems had met with a commission panel had been made in a brief statement that Namiri had drafted, which described the meeting as a productive beginning to a formal engagement process and which said nothing else because nothing else had been decided yet, and describing undecided things was not the compound's practice. Inside the compound, the weeks after the review felt like the weeks after a significant storm. The quality of light was different, the air had a clarity that was the specific clarity of things that have been tested and have held, and the ordinary operations resumed with the sense not of returning to normal but of normal having expanded to include something larger. Ray painted the courtyard. She had been wanting to paint it since she arrived, and she had been waiting, not consciously but in the way that the right conditions make themselves known when they arrive, for the moment when the courtyard was fully what it was going to be. She sat at the table by her window every morning for 2 weeks and painted, and the courtyard as it appeared in the paintings was the courtyard as it had been at the moment of the demonstration, full of light and ice and the particular quality of something that had been completely itself. She gave one painting to Izuku, who hung it in the workshop. She gave one to Inko, who put it in the receiving room. She kept one, above the window in her room. Namiri began the formal commission engagement process, which was slow and procedurally intensive in the way of all commission processes, but which was moving. Yokoi was her primary contact on the technical side and had proven to be a person who could be worked with, which was not something that could be said of all commission technical staff and which Namiri considered a material asset. The engagement process was not going to produce a fast outcome. It was going to produce a documented, formal, irreversible beginning to a relationship between the compound and the commission that was defined by the compound's terms rather than the commission's categories. This was the objective. Izuku sent Yokoi the derivations. Her response came 3 days later and was 4 pages long and was the most technically engaged thing anyone had sent him since Mura's annotated review of the first 4 devices 11 years ago. She had found 2 places in the derivations where the argumentation was technically sound but could be made more rigorous, and she described them with the specific language of a person who had been working in adjacent territory and understood the landscape. He wrote back the same day and they had a technical exchange that lasted 6 weeks and produced, at the end of it, a joint paper that neither of them had intended to write but which the exchange had generated naturally, the way certain conversations generate documents that need to exist. The paper was published under both their names. It was the first joint publication between Midori Technical Systems and a commission affiliate. Neither the paper's text nor the author notes said anything about this. The fact was the paper. The compound grew. It crossed 60 residents in December. The letters in the file were answered on a rolling basis by Inko, who had developed a process for evaluating them that was based not on qualifications or connections but on 2 questions. Could this person contribute to what the compound was building? and was this a person who needed what the compound offered? Both questions were weighted equally, because the compound had always been both a technical enterprise and a community, and the two requirements were not ranked. 3 new residents arrived in January. 2 were engineers. One was a woman whose quirk assessment history was, in its particulars, the kind of reading that Inko had developed an eye for after 5 years, a power assessed at low scale at an early age, with no reassessment, with a life organized around the assumption that the assessment was permanent. She was put in contact with Izuku on her second day. He looked at her quirk assessment documentation and asked her several questions and made notes and told her he would need 2 weeks to design something. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting their whole life for a sentence like that and had given up waiting. 2 weeks, she said. Probably less, he said. But I don't want to promise less. She nodded and thanked him and went to the shared kitchen and had dinner with the compound's community and sat at the long table surrounded by people who were not performing welcome but were simply welcoming because that was what the community did, and she ate and talked and did not have to be any particular thing. In the workshop that evening Izuku opened a new notebook. He had never numbered them on the cover, only in the catalog, but he knew this one was number 129. He wrote at the top of the first page the name he had been thinking about for 3 months and had not yet said aloud. The compound was no longer the right word. The compound was what it had been when it was smaller and less itself. What it was now was a city-state in function if not yet in formal designation, independent power, independent water, independent communication, a community with its own internal culture and its own external relationships and its own economy that was not rich but was sufficient and was not growing for the sake of growth but for the sake of doing more of what it was already doing. The name he wrote at the top of the page was Midori. Not the company. The place. He wrote it and then sat back and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a thing when you have put it in the world for the first time and the world has received it and you are finding out whether it is what you thought it would be. It was. He began writing in the notebook, the next phase, the formal designation process, the architectural plans for the additional residential block that 60 people required and that would be ready in spring, the expanded training facility for the new armor design he had been working on since August, the proposal he was going to make to the commission in 3 months for a formal recognition framework that did not yet have a name in their documentation but which would by the time he finished writing it. He wrote until the workshop lights were the only lights in the compound and the winter outside was doing what winter did, pressing against the windows and being held back by the things that had been built to hold it back, and the city of Muzitafu beyond the walls was large and indifferent and full of the apparatus of a society that had been built around a certain set of assumptions about what power was and who could have it. The assumptions were not all wrong. They were not all right. And there was, now, in the industrial residential boundary zone of northern Muzitafu, a place that was an answer to the gap between the assumptions and the reality, a place built by a quirkless boy with notebooks and plans and hands that had turned out to be very specifically for this, built with a mother whose power had always been larger than anyone had looked carefully enough to see, and with 2 women whose histories in the system had given them, along with the costs, a precise and practical understanding of everything the system was not. The understanding was not a weapon. It was a tool, and the compound, which was now Midori, was what had been built with it. Izuku closed the notebook at 2 in the morning. He turned off the workshop lights. He walked through the compound in the dark, past the greenhouse and the library and the residential block where 63 people were asleep, past the courtyard where Rei's ice structures from the morning's training were faintly visible in the winter dark, past the fitting room where 3 armors and the beginning of a 4th waited on their frames with the patient readiness of things built for a purpose that was not finished yet. He went to his room. He stood at the window. The city beyond the wall was doing what it always did at this hour, the particular nighttime respiration of an enormous system of people and machines and infrastructure and the hero apparatus that overlaid all of it, enormous and certain and very used to being the only model available. There was another model now. It was 63 people and 3 armors and a patent and a joint paper and a commission engagement process and a name written at the top of a page in notebook number 129. It was not finished. It was not supposed to be finished. It was supposed to be building, always, the way real things build, not toward a final state but toward a better version of what they already were, and then a better one than that, and then a better one, And the building was the thing and the thing was the building and there was no end point that was the point because the point was the work and the work was always there. He turned away from the window. He went to sleep. In the morning there would be more to build.